Chapter 993. Perhaps it was because Yi Li's reputation in the Mahist army was already high enough. Or perhaps it was because all of the Mahist army's generals were extremely calm and composed. After the news of Mo Xiaoyao's heavy injuries spread, the Mahist army did not fall into chaos and low morale as Feng Zhiyao and the others had feared. In fact, 10 days later, when the news of Mo Xiaoyao's death spread, the entire Mahist army did not have many problems. Instead, all of the soldiers of the Mo family army felt more hatred towards the enemy and shared a common enemy. When they actually received Mo Xiaoyao's obituary, everyone couldn't help but be stunned. Even Mo Jingli, who had been full of confidence, and Lei Jinting, who had been somewhat worried, could not believe it. No one could believe that Mo Xiaoyao, the man who had caused everyone to be jealous of him, the man who had controlled half of the world for 10 years, had actually died just like that. Looking at the letter in front of him, Lei Jinting sighed with a complicated expression. Father. Lei Tingfeng stood to the side, looking at Lei Jinting's expression that seemed to be both happy and sad at the same time. Mo Xiaoyao's death was naturally a good thing, but he did not know why his father had such an expression. This made Lei Tingfeng have a bad feeling. Father, but is there a problem with the news of Mo Xiaoyao's death? In reality, Lei Tingfeng also did not dare to believe that Mo Xiaoyao had died just like that. Mo Xiaoyao's cunning and fickleness had also left a deep impression on Lei Tingfeng, so he couldn't help but suspect that Mo Xiaoyao had faked his death. However, he did not understand why Mo Xiaoyao had faked his death. Originally, this war had already been gradually leaning towards the Prince Ding mansion. As long as nothing unexpected happened, even if the stalemate continued for another 2 or 3 years, the Prince Ding mansion's chances of winning were much higher than Jinan Palace's. Mo Xiaoyao's arrival could be said to have completely given up all of their early advantages. Lei Jinting frowned and shook his head. It doesn't seem like it, but we can't do anything about it. Send someone to investigate again. We must confirm whether Mo Xiaoyao is really dead or not. If Mo Xiaoyao had really faked his death, he definitely had a big plan and they could not let their guard down. However, in the current situation, if he stood still and did nothing, it was impossible for him to give up on this opportunity for nothing. Your son understands. Lei Tingfeng nodded. Of course, he also understood the importance of this matter. Another person who had the same thoughts as Lei Jinting was Mo Jingli, who was far away outside the Cold Valley Pass. In a secret stronghold somewhere in the Prince Ding mansion, Mo Xiaoyao looked at the secret memorial that his subordinate had presented and did not know whether to laugh or cry. Looking at the memorial filled with his own words, he could not help but mutter softly, "Li must be angry. This is terrible. But this is hard to come by." However, since Li had announced the news of his death, she must have a way to convince others of the authenticity of this news. This was extremely beneficial for his secret plans. As expected, not hiding it from Li was a good decision. If Feng Zhiyao and the others were in charge of the situation at Feihong Pass right now, they would have made a fool of themselves. This had nothing to do with ability. It was just that Feng Zhiyao and the others did not have Yi Li's prestige and status. They also did not have the tacit understanding between them and Mo Xiaoyao that did not require words. Prince. The subordinate standing in front of him looked at the muttering prince in front of him, saying somewhat uncomprehendingly. Mo Xiaoyao's lips curled up in a smile, saying, "The battlefield will be left to Li and Feng San. We should also go and make preparations." To be able to find such an opportunity to leave the battlefield without being suspected was really not easy. After all, his martial arts were really too strong. If there was no explanation for them working together, even if his corpse was placed in front of Lei Jinting would probably think that it was someone else in disguise. Infinite boundless mountain. This was really a good excuse. Since that was the case, he naturally had to make use of this opportunity to give Lei Jinting and Mo Jingli a heaven-shaking, earth-shattering gift. But Prince, your injuries. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head and glanced at his chest, waving his hand nonchalantly, saying, "What kind of injury is this? It's no big deal. Go." Yes, your subordinate will take his leave. Prince Ding's passing was a heaven-shaking, earth-shattering matter. Naturally, it could not be dealt with carelessly. Therefore, as soon as the news spread, the entire Mahist army camp in Feihong Pass were immediately covered in white cloth. Everywhere was covered with white cloth, the entire army wearing mourning clothes. When the commoners near Feihong Pass received the news, they also wore white clothes, many of them even crying out in pain. In this chaotic world, the commoners of the Northwest had always been living peacefully and peacefully. This was all thanks to the protection of the Prince Ding mansion. Now the commoners' pain was not only because they were worried about their own future, but also because they were mourning and sorrowful for the death of the Prince Ding Mo Xiuyao. Princess Genom of Gojoseon of West Hill has come. Within Feihong Pass, Yili was sitting in the study, reading through the tall pile of memorials on the table in front of her. Mo Xiuyao's sudden death naturally meant that there were countless things to deal with. Whether it was Feihong Pass or the Prince Ding mansion in Glass City, everyone was extremely busy. Su Hongyu, Su Qingchen and the others in Glass City were also so busy after sending someone to deliver a letter that they did not have any free time. Yili raised her head and looked at Qin Feng, frowning, saying, "Lei Zhenting? What is he doing here?" Qin Feng said, "Naturally, he is here to mourn the prince." Even though the two sides were enemies now, Lei Zhenting had come to mourn in the name of West Hill. The Mahist army could not do anything to him. Casually putting the memorials to one side, Yili stood up and said, "Mourn? He is here to investigate, right? I thought he would send Lei Tingfeng." Qin Feng thought for a moment and laughed in a low voice. "Between us subordinates, he is probably afraid that Princess will really kill Lei Tingfeng in a fit of anger." Lei Tingfeng was Lei Zhenting's only son, and Lei Zhenting was almost 60 now. It was probably too late to raise another son. "Fine, let's go meet him. Get people to prepare. Mo Jingli is probably coming," Yili said. "Mo Jingli?" Qin Feng frowned and said, "Does he dare to come?" Mo Jingli was not a daring person. Going deep into the enemy's camp did not seem like something Mo Jingli would do. Yili walked out as she said, "He should have already received the news. Based on my understanding of Mo Jingli, he will not miss such an opportunity." After all, in Mo Jingli's life, Mo Xiuyao's death was the first time and possibly the only time. "I understand." Qin Feng nodded and said. In the hall, Lei Zhenting sipped his tea while sizing up the entire hall. This mansion was originally the general's mansion in Feihong Pass. It was not particularly big nor was it very luxurious. After Mo Xiuyao and the others moved in, they clearly did not put in any effort to decorate. Now that the entire mansion was covered by a plain white cloth, it was even colder and more dignified. Not far away, Feng Zhiyao, who was in charge of receiving guests, and Leng Haoyu, who had just rushed back from the Chu capital, glared at Lei Zhenting with very unfriendly eyes. Being treated like this, Lei Zhenting was not angry. He just sat calmly and drank tea. After going to the morning hall to burn incense, Lei Zhenting was considering how to personally see Mo Xiuyao's corpse. In such a heavily guarded mansion, it was obviously not feasible to sneak in and investigate. Chapter 994. This subordinate greets the princess. Yili was wearing a plain white robe, her cloud-like hair casually tied into a simple bun. A white flower was pinned into the bun, making her look even colder and paler. Standing on Yili's left was Mo Xiaobao, who was wearing a black brocade robe and a white muslin robe. As soon as he entered, Mo Xiaobao glared fiercely at Lei Zhenting. Looking at Mo Xiaobao, who was glaring at him, Lei Zhenting couldn't help but smile. In his heart, he sighed that Mo Xiuyao had given birth to a good son. Although he was still young, he already had the style of his father. Just by looking at his round and cute eyes that couldn't hide his shrewdness, he knew that this kid was definitely not as cute and obedient as he looked on the surface. "Princess Ding Shitzi, please restrain your grief." Lei Zhenting stood up and cupped his hands. Yili nodded slightly and said with a faint smile, "I'll have to trouble Genom of Gojoseon to personally make a trip. Genom of Gojoseon, please sit." Lei Zhenting looked at Yili and said with a sincere face, "I also feel very sorry for Prince Ding's sudden death. Although the Prince Ding mansion is the enemy of the West Hill, it is also an opponent that I respect. I came this time to mourn Prince Ding, and also to discuss the matter of peace with the Prince Ding mansion." Satisfied to see the flash of surprise in Yili's eyes, Lei Zhenting smiled faintly and didn't say anything. Feng Zhiyao and Leng Haoyu also stared at Lei Zhenting in disbelief. Everyone was well aware of the relationship between the Prince Ding mansion and the West Hill. Once Lei Zhenting confirmed that Prince Ding was really gone, he would definitely immediately annex the Prince Ding mansion without hesitation. At this moment, only a fool would believe that he was a gentleman and would not bully a widow and an orphan. Yili raised her eyebrows and looked at Lei Zhenting with a faint smile. "Peace talks." Lei Zhenting nodded and said, that's right. Now that Prince Ding has passed away, I'm sure Princess Ding won't be able to cope for the time being. If the princess agrees, the West Hill is willing to make peace with the Prince Ding mansion. Yili smiled and said, if so, the Prince Ding mansion would be more than happy to oblige. Here this consort thanks Genom of Gojosian. Looking at Yi Li's decent smile, Lei Zhenting frowned in his heart. However, there was a trace of exhaustion in her eyes. For a moment he couldn't tell if Yi Li was putting on an act or if it was real. Even with his experience in reading people, he couldn't see any flaws in Yi Li. Just now when he said peace talks, he just wanted to test Yi Li's thoughts and the Chu Jing in the Prince Ding mansion. But Yi Li's attitude made him unable to figure out the situation inside the Prince Ding mansion. Reporting to the princess, the Emperor of Chu is outside the pass asking for an audience. Outside the door, the guard reported loudly. Lei Zhenting's eyes flashed slightly, but there was no other expression on his face. He looked sideways at Yi Li sitting at the head of the table, wanting to see how she planned to deal with it. He heard Yi Li say indifferently, Emperor Chu has come from afar. Invite him in. Feng San, bring the heir to welcome Emperor Chu. The etiquette of a formal occasion couldn't be neglected because of something. Even though it looked like Genom of Gojosian was more powerful than Mo Jingli, Mo Jingli was still the ruler of a country. Sending someone to welcome him was the proper etiquette. This subordinate obeys. Feng Xiao replied in a deep voice. This child obeys. Mo Xiaobao jumped down from the chair next to Yi Li and followed Feng Xiao out. The subordinates of the Prince Ding mansion are truly loyal. Lei Zhenting looked at Feng Xiao walking out and said meaningfully. With Feng Xiao's arrogance, going out to welcome Mo Jingli was enough to show the Prince Ding mansion's allegiance to Yi Li. It was clear that the Prince Ding mansion didn't have the slightest bit of chaos in Yi Li's hands. Even if it was true, the loss was only Mo Xiaoyao. Thinking of this, Lei Zhenting looked at Yi Li with an even more complicated expression. He secretly regretted that Yi Li had actually escaped Ling Taihan's assassination a few days ago. Leng Haoyu, who was sitting at the side, snorted and said with a smile, Genom of Gojosian is too kind. A loyal subject doesn't serve two masters. We are just doing what we should do. Looking at Leng Haoyu's unkind eyes, Lei Zhenting didn't care and smiled faintly. Yi Li glanced at Leng Haoyu with a smile and didn't feel offended at all. Genom of Gojosian is right. If it weren't for their help these days, this concubine is really a little powerless. In this case, why doesn't Princess Ding invite young Master Qingchen to preside over the overall situation? Lei Zhenting asked. This was also what he was most confused about. Under normal circumstances, if Mo Xiaoyao was really dead, then the Prince Ding mansion was bound to support Mo Yuchen to take the throne. But now Mo Yuchen was less than 9 years old. Naturally, it was impossible for him to take charge of the Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army. Therefore, Yi Li should summon Su Qingchen or Su Hongyu to preside over the overall situation in the Feihong Pass. But now no one from the Su family appeared, which made Lei Zhenting suspicious of Mo Xiaoyao's death. Yi Li smiled bitterly and shook her head. Glass City also needs my eldest brother to preside over the overall situation. What's more? Shaking her head, Yi Li didn't say anything more. Undoubtedly, it made people more fanciful. Of course, Lei Zhenting knew the importance of the entire Northwest to the Prince Ding mansion. What's more, after the news of Mo Xiaoyao's death came out, he secretly ordered the troops in Xiling to move to the north. He didn't really want to attack the original emperor of Xiling, but to contain Zhang Qilan's army stationed in the west. There was also the northern tribes. Mo Xiaoyao had just destroyed almost half of the troops of the northern tribes, and a prince had died. Now that he heard the news of Mo Xiaoyao's death, how could the king of the northern tribes not come out to make trouble to save his face? Therefore, at this time, whether the northwest, especially Glass City, could be stabilized was particularly important. As long as the northwest was still there, even if the Mahist army was defeated this time, there was still a place to retreat. When Mo Yuchen grew up in a few years, it was not impossible for the Mahist army to make a comeback. After all, according to Lei Zhenting's understanding of the bloodline inheritance of the Prince Ding mansion, there was almost no doubt that Mo Yuchen could take charge alone when he was a teenager. Of course, Lei Zhenting didn't intend to give him this opportunity. Looking at Yi Li's hesitant appearance, Lei Zhenting believed the news of Mo Xiaoyao's death even more. Lei Zhenting didn't care that Yi Li didn't cry like an ordinary girl, and her beautiful face was pale. After all, Yili wasn't an ordinary girl. If she really couldn't control herself at this time, Enchanting would suspect her or look down on her. Princess. Princess, it's not good. Outside the door, a guard hurried in to report. Yili frowned slightly and asked, "What's wrong?" The guard looked at Enchanting and said with some difficulty, "Little Prince. Little Prince injured Emperor Chu." Everyone present was stunned. No matter how powerful Emo Xiaobao was, he was only an 8 or 9-year-old child. How could he injure Emo Jingli? The guard saw everyone's doubtful eyes and quickly said, "It's true, Little Prince." Little Prince fiercely bit Emperor Chu. "Is Little Prince okay?" Leng Haoyu quickly asked. He didn't have much hope for Emo Jingli's character. Emo Jingli was a petty person. He wouldn't let Emo Xiaobao off just because he was a child. The guard wiped his sweat and said, "Little Prince is fine." But Little Prince said that he wanted to kill Emperor Chu. Young Master Feng San couldn't stop him. "Princess, please go and take a look." Chapter 995. Yili lowered her eyes to hide the smile in her eyes. She stood up and said somewhat anxiously to Enchanting, "Genom of Gojoseon, I'm really sorry. This consort will leave first." Enchanting smiled. "Wang Fei is too polite. How about I accompany Wang Fei to take a look?" Yili hesitated, but in the end she couldn't resist the worry for her son. She nodded and said, "Genom of Gojoseon, pleased. Wang Fei, please." Yili didn't stand on ceremony with him and hurriedly walked out of the hall. Not far from the Fu's entrance, Emo Jingli's ceremonial guards and the Prince Ding Mansion's guards completely blocked off the narrow street. In the middle of the crowd, Emo Jingli was wearing a bright yellow imperial robe. He was glaring angrily at Emo Xiaobao. There was a bloody wound on his right hand that was placed in front of him. It was clear that the person who had bitten him didn't have any intention of showing mercy. Emo Xiaobao was tightly held in Feng Jiao's arms. But from the anger on his little face and the way he was fiercely baring his teeth at Emo Jingli, it was clear that if Feng Jiao hadn't held him tightly, Emo Xiaobao would have immediately charged forward. "What happened?" Yili walked in from the back of the crowd and asked with a frown. Seeing that Yili had arrived, Feng Jiao clearly let out a sigh of relief. He wasn't afraid that the little Shitzi would bite Emo Jingli, but he was worried that Emo Jingli would hurt Emo Xiaobao in his anger. "Nyongtin." Feng Jiao let go of Emo Xiaobao. Emo Xiaobao threw himself into Yili's arms, feeling wronged. She rubbed her little face against Yili's chest and glared at Emo Jingli with her big round eyes. Her delicate little face was full of grievances, which was very different from the fierce look she had when she was about to pounce on Emo Jingli. Yili held him in her arms and gently patted him. She said softly, "What's wrong with Xiaobao? Are you hurt?" Emo Xiaobao buried his face in Yili's arms and shook his head. Yili heaved a sigh of relief. She patted his little head and said, "It's good that you're fine. Be careful. What if you get hurt? He's a bad guy. Xiaobao hates him." Emo Xiaobao said, feeling wronged. His childish voice spread far and wide. Everyone present could not help but glance at Emo Jingli. How bad was he to make the cute little heir of the Prince Ding Mansion hate him so much? Emo Jingli's face immediately darkened. He had almost been bitten by this brat. This brat dared to complain first. "Yili, is this how you teach your son? You really don't know the rules." Emo Jingli glared at Yili and said in a cold voice. Yili's eyes darkened slightly. She stood up and looked at Emo Jingli without showing any weakness. She calmly said, "How this Fei teaches my son does not need Emperor Chu to care. If Emperor Chu has the time, he should be teaching his own son." Pfft. At the side, Feng Jiao couldn't help but burst out in laughter. Wang Fei had definitely stepped on Emo Jingli's sore spot. Who in the world did not know that King Li was already 30 years old? Not to mention a son, he did not even have a daughter. There were even rumors among the people that King Li had an incurable disease. Of course, Feng Jiao, a confidant of the Prince Ding Mansion, knew better. Because he knew, Feng Jiao almost wanted to sympathize with Emo Jingli. The most painful thing in the world was not to have something, but to have something and then lose it. After regaining it, you found that it was all for naught. Therefore, even if one cursed Emo Jingli 100 times, it would not be as angry as Princess Ding's light words to Emo Jingli. "Yili!" Emo Jingli shouted harshly. Yili turned around and held Emo Xiaobao's hand to face Emo Jingli. She said in a deep voice, This Fey respects Emperor Chu as the ruler of a country, but if Emperor Chu does not have the slightest etiquette as a guest, then forgive this Fey for not seeing you off." Emo Jingli was so angry that he laughed. He raised his hand and said with a cold smile, "Jin came to offer condolences out of kindness," but just as Jin closed the door, Jin was bitten by this brat. Is this how the Prince Ding mansion treats its guests? Emo Xiaobao stood beside Yi Li. He raised his delicate little chin and said in a crisp voice, "You're not here to offer condolences to father, you're here to cause trouble. People who come to offer condolences to father will not wear clothes like yours." Everyone once again looked at Emo Jingli. Even if Emo Jingli was the emperor, the Prince Ding mansion's status was not inferior to the Dechu states. As a guest, they were not required to wear mourning clothes, but they should at least change into plain clothes. They should not be like Emo Jingli, who came in wearing a bright dragon robe. Standing on the side, Lei Jinting, who was wearing a black robe with dark patterns, suddenly felt the Mahist army's eyes looking at him become much friendlier. Emo Jingli's attire did not seem like he was here to offer condolences, but to show off and cause trouble. Emo Jingli was speechless. He really did not come to offer condolences to Emo Shuyao. When Emo Shuyao died, he wanted to laugh even in his dreams. How could he come to offer condolences? But being exposed by a child in front of so many people, he still felt a bit embarrassed. After a while, Emo Jingli gave a soft snort. He looked at Yi Li and said, "Princess Ding, Jin came from far away. Do you want to stop Jin here?" Yi Li calmly glanced at him and said, "If Emperor Chu truly came to offer condolences to Prince Ding, this consort naturally does not dare to stop you." Emo Jingli proudly said, "Jin naturally came for this reason." Yi Li calmly nodded and said, "Since it's like this, then King Li, please come to the coffin and light a stick of incense." Emo Jingli did not object. He nodded and said, "Perfect, Jin also wants to see Prince Ding's body. After all, we have been friends since childhood. Presumably Princess Ding will not object, right?" Yi Li was silent for a moment before lightly saying, "Emperor Chu, please." Chapter 996. Emo Jingli's group was quickly led to the morning hall of the general's residence where Yi Li was temporarily staying. Because it had been placed here temporarily, the morning hall was not large. The entire morning hall was covered by a white cloth and gave people a cold and bleak feeling. Emo Shuyao's coffin was placed in the center of the morning hall. There were countless flowers piled around the coffin. In front of the coffin there was a memorial tablet engraved with the words, "Prince Ding, Emo Shuyao's memorial tablet." Standing in the morning hall, both Emo Jingli and Lei Jinting felt a moment of nervousness and excitement. They were about to see Prince Ding's corpse. As his enemy, it was hard not to be excited. Wang Fei. Inside the morning hall, Ajin's eyes were red as he stared warily at Emo Jingli and Lei Jinting in front of him. His gaze towards Emo Jingli was filled with viciousness. If this was not Emo Shuyao's morning hall, he would have already leapt forward. Knowing what he had done to Emo Shuyao, Emo Jingli felt slightly guilty under Ajin's stare and couldn't help but take a step back. But he quickly became happy again. No matter what he had done, Emo Shuyao was dead. After so many years of fighting, he had won in the end. Also, Emo Jingli looked disdainfully at Ajin. Just based on this little fool who had followed Emo Shuyao since childhood, it would not be easy for him to kill him. Yi Li said coolly, "Emperor Chu and Genom of Gojoseon want to open the coffin to see Prince." Ajin stilled and then glared viciously at Emo Jingli. "No. The prince has already been placed in the coffin. How can it be opened again?" What Ajin wanted to say was that he was the murderer of the prince, so how could he allow him to disturb the prince's rest? Lei Jinting understood Ajin's thoughts. He took a step forward and said with a smile, "I and the others really want to send Prince Ding off. Why don't you let me take a look at Prince Ding so as not to disturb Prince Ding's peace? What does Wang Fei think?" Yi Li frowned. Her expression was clearly displeased, but she did not object. Emo Jingli didn't object. Although it was a pity that he couldn't see Emo Shuyao's corpse with his own eyes, the most important thing right now was to confirm whether Emo Shuyao was dead or alive. He believed that Lei Jinting had no reason to lie to him about this matter. Yi Li gently patted Ajin's shoulder and said softly, "Let them see the prince, then they won't disturb him again." Ajin looked at Yi Li. Ever since Emo Shuyao had passed away, other than his uncle, Yili was the person Jin trusted the most. Even his fiancée Qing Shuang was ranked behind her. Hearing Yili's words, Jin glared fiercely at Jingli. He walked over and carefully pushed the lid of the coffin over. Because it needed to be sent back to Glass City before it could be buried, the lid of the coffin had not been nailed shut yet. Jin only pushed it lightly and it was pushed open. Jingli and Genom of Gojoseon didn't mind Jin's rudeness at all because their thoughts were on the open coffin. Lei Jinting took a few steps forward and smelled a strong fragrance. This was a kind of perfume used by nobles to preserve their corpses. Usually only nobles above the rank of prince could use it. There was also the fragrance of Phoebe Janon wood. Lei Jinting couldn't help but frown slightly. Inside the coffin, a white-haired man dressed in a white robe embroidered with silver dragons and clouds lay quietly. Even though the weather was still cold, the coffin had a preservative perfume and the coffin itself was still placed on a large piece of ice. Therefore the corpse hadn't changed much. If it wasn't for the fact that it was deathly pale, it could even be said to be lifelike. Lei Jinting's sharp eyes saw that there was another scar on the man's right hand that was exposed to the air. Even though it had been carefully treated, it was still clearly visible. Thinking about the information he had received from Jingli, Lei Jinting stared at the man's unusually handsome face and frowned. He finally raised his hand and reached into the coffin. Genom of Gojoseon, what are you doing? Standing at the side, Yili saw his actions and asked in displeasure. Lei Jinting smiled faintly and said, I see that Prince Ding's sleeve is slightly untidy. I have been rude. Lei Jinting calmly pulled on the white sleeve and turned to smile apologetically at Yili. Yili looked down. Is there anything else between Genom of Gojoseon and Emperor Chu? If there is nothing else. Lei Jinting smiled and said, Wang Fei, please do as you wish. I will not disturb Prince Ding's rest. Many thanks. Jin, close it. Yili ordered Jin in a soft voice. Jin snorted angrily at Lei Jinting and went to close the coffin again. Coming out of the morning hall, Jingli and Lei Jinting were invited to rest in a side courtyard of the General Fu. Feihong Pass was not Li City and it was not the time for Xiuyao's official funeral, so there were not many people here. The General Fu was not big, but it was still convenient for Lei Jinting and Jingli to live in. Emperor Chu, why don't we have a cup of tea together? Lei Jinting said. Even though they had only come to pay respects, it was already late and they could not avoid staying at Feihong Pass for the night before leaving. Jingli naturally agreed. He also had many questions to ask Lei Jinting. The two went to Lei Jinting's courtyard and waved away the servant girl who had brought tea and snacks. Lei Jinting smiled and said, Congratulations, Emperor Chu. Jingli stilled and quickly realized what Lei Jinting meant. The person lying in the coffin is really Xiuyao? Lei Jinting said, he has lost a lot of blood but there are no obvious wounds on the outside. He should have injured his heart. There is a scar on his right wrist and a callus on his palm. It is caused by long-term sword practice. Also, this person was an expert when he was alive. His face was not disguised and his hair was not dyed. If there is a person who looks exactly like Xiuyao and is as skilled as Xiuyao, then Xiuyao is not dead. After a while he heard Jingli murmur, Xiuyao is really dead. Yes. Lei Jinting sighed softly. Xiuyao is really dead. Such an outstanding person had died just like that. Lei Jinting's eyes suddenly showed some confusion and melancholy. Jingli was not in the mood to pay attention to Lei Jinting's thoughts. After hearing Lei Jinting's words, he could not help but laugh loudly. That's great. Xiuyao. You still died in front of me in the end. But seeing Jingli's smug appearance, Lei Jinting's eyes flashed with disdain and anger. He also wanted Xiuyao to die because he was an enemy. But to be treated as an enemy by someone like Xiuyao was an honor. But to be treated as an enemy by someone like Jingli was a disgrace. There had never been a person like Jingli that Lei Jinting recognized as an enemy. He was just a clown. When Jingli was done laughing, he finally seemed to sense Lei Jinting's displeasure. Jingli raised his eyebrows. Xiuyao is dead. Is Genom of Gojoseon not happy? Lei Jinting's lips twitched, revealing a mocking smile. Of course not as happy as Emperor Chu. Chapter 997. Hearing this, Jingli could not help but feel a little embarrassed. There were not many people in the world who did not know about the grudges between the Prince Ding mansion and the royal family of Dechu state. His reaction just now was seen by Lei Jinting. No matter how thick-skinned Emo Jingli was, he could not help but blush. He snorted and said harshly, Emo Shuyao betrayed the country first. This kind of traitor naturally deserves to die. Lei Jinting took a sip of tea and said indifferently, I do not intend to discuss with Emperor Chu whether Prince Ding deserves to die or not. Prince Ding's death is naturally beneficial to I. Emo Jingli's eyes flashed with anger and disbelief. He said dryly, in that case, Genom of Gojoseon, please say it. There was a kind of person who was born stunning. He was the focus of the world's attention. Even his enemies would admire and respect him. Emo Shuyao was such a person. It was also because of this that Emo Jingli was crazily jealous. Lei Jinting leisurely looked at Emo Jingli, who was a little unsteady, and said calmly, did Emperor Chu notice that the main generals in the Mahist army are not here? Emo Jingli hesitated. From the beginning he focused on Yi Li and Emo Xiaobao. Naturally he did not notice who was not in the Prince Ding mansion. Hearing Lei Jinting's words, he finally had some impression. He nodded and said, yes, Murong Shin and Marquis Nan are not here. They should have been sent out by Yi Li, Lei Jinting said. Emo Jingli frowned and said, sent out? Yi Li doesn't want to guard Fei Hong Pass anymore? Lei Jinting glanced at him and said, it's really because she wants to guard Fu Fei Hong Pass that she sent people out. Genom of Gojoseon, what do you mean by that? Emo Jingli did not like Lei Jinting's tone. It was as if he was calling him an idiot. However, he really couldn't understand Yi Li's thoughts, so he had no choice but to hold back his anger and listen to Lei Jinting. Fei Hong Pass is only so big. Even if all the generals are here, what difference would it make? But if Murong Shin, Marquis Nan and the others were sent out, they were all famous veterans on the battlefield. They don't need to confront us face to face. As long as they want to cause us some trouble, it will be easy. Furthermore, the Black Cloud cavalry of the Mahist army was adept at long-distance raids. When the time came, I'm afraid that both sides will have a headache. Lei Jinting said. Emo Jingli gritted his teeth and said, is it really Yi Li's idea? How cunning. Lei Jinting smiled with appreciation and said, Princess Ding can stabilize the situation of the entire Prince Ding mansion as a woman at this time. Naturally, she is not an ordinary person. Princess Ding is a man. I'm afraid. Lei Jinting shook his head and smiled faintly without saying a word. Emo Jingli snorted and asked, what does Genom of Gojoseon want to discuss with me? Lei Jinting looked at Emo Jingli and said, give up Cold Valley Pass and lead the army to the west. After the two armies join forces, we will attack Fei Hong Pass together. Emo Jingli narrowed his eyes and sneered, Genom of Gojoseon is really smart. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that I will be betrayed by Genom of Gojoseon again. Last time he was fooled by Lei Tingfeng. Emo Jingli did not forget. How could he trust Lei Jinting again? Lei Jinting frowned and said, as long as we take Fei Hong Pass, we will lead the army to sweep the entire northwest. After destroying the foundation of the Prince Ding mansion, do you think that Ling Huai of Chujing and Lu Jingxian of Cold Valley Pass still need us to worry about them? Emo Jingli was not an idiot. How do I know that once I lead the army to the west, Ling Huai and Lu Jingxian will not chase after us? In the future, won't I be in a dilemma? Lei Jinting raised his eyebrows and said, so, Emperor Chu has the confidence to fight against Ling Huai and Lu Jingxian alone? I have received news that Ling Huai has begun to reorganize the troops in Chujing. They will set out for Cold Valley Pass in a few days. Cold Valley Pass is the most impregnable pass in the Central Plains. But it also depends on who is guarding it. Being mocked by Lei Jinting like this, Emo Jingli's face turned green and white. What does Genom of Gojoseon want to do? Lei Jinting nodded with satisfaction and said, Emperor Chu, please block Ling Huai and Lu Jingxian's army. I do not need the Chu army to do anything, I just need to stall for time and not let them mess things up. Although being looked down upon by Lei Jinting made Emo Jingli feel humiliated, he did not want to use his own troops to fight against Lu Jingxian and Ling Huai. Rather than this, it was better to wait for Lei Jinting and the Mahist army to fight until both sides suffered losses, then he would be the third party to reap the benefits. How could Lei Jinting not understand Emo Jingli's thoughts? But he did not care and smiled coldly. Okay, we will do as Genom of Gojoseon says. Emo Jingli nodded and agreed to Lei Jinting's suggestion. In the study in the deepest part of the general's fu, Yili sat behind a desk and looked at the people in the room. She couldn't help but sigh. Feng Jiao stared at Yili and said, Wang Fei, do you know the whereabouts of the prince or not? Yili shook her head and said seriously, I really don't know. It was a pity that her sincere answer could not make Feng Jiao and the others believe her. Wang Fei, do you think we will believe you? Yili raised an eyebrow and looked at everyone with a smile. Han Mingyue said with a faint smile, Wang Fei should at least know some news about Xiaoyao. Otherwise, how would Wang Fei know what wounds Xiaoyao should have? After Genom of Gojoseon saw Prince Ding's wounds, his brow visibly relaxed. When he faced Yili, his smile became more sincere. It was clear that Genom of Gojoseon had received the news that Prince Ding was wounded, and the wounds on Prince Ding's body matched the information that Enchanting had received. Yili sighed helplessly and said, I really don't know. It's fine since Wang Fei can't say, we won't ask. Feng Jiao clearly still did not believe that Yili did not know. He just thought that it was because Yili could not say. But at least it proved that Mo Xiaoyao's safety was not a problem. Everyone present couldn't help but sigh in relief. Even though they vaguely understood that the prince was still alive, it was still uneasy to not have definite news. Now that they saw Wang Fei's calm appearance, it was as if they had eaten a calming pill. Mother, can we kill that big bad guy? Mo Xiaobao sat next to Yili and asked with a pure face. Yili lowered her head to look at Mo Xiaobao, who was looking at her. She couldn't help but smile and said, When did you learn to bite people? This time it was definitely Mo Xiaobao who did not care about his image at all. Even though Mo Xiaobao liked to fool around, he was still very proud. Even if he wanted to prank someone, he would not use this kind of trick that a normal child would use. Mo Xiaobao said with a smile, Is this child's acting good? Yili raised a brow and looked at Feng Jiao at the side. Feng Jiao said with a smile, When little Shitzi saw Mo Jingli, the first thing he said was, You bastard who killed my father king, I'll bite you to death. Then he pounced on Mo Jingli and fiercely bit Mo Jingli. I saw that a piece of flesh on Mo Jingli's body was almost bitten off. He really has good teeth. The others couldn't help but cover their faces and laugh in a low voice. Mo Xiaobao's little face became embarrassed and he said unhappily, It was so smelly. This Shitzi had to drink a lot of water to rinse my mouth. Next time I'll definitely use another method. However, this method was the most satisfying and also the least likely to be suspicious. If he used something else to hurt Mo Jingli, it wouldn't be a child's mischief that could be explained away. Chapter 998. Yili looked at Xiaobao curiously and asked, What else did Xiaobao do to Mo Jingli? Yili knew her son well enough. He would not bite someone just to vent his anger or to make Mo Jingli look bad. Xiaobao chuckled and said, I sprinkled the medicine that Mr. Shin gave me on his hand. Shin Yang, who was sitting at the side listening to their conversation and taking care of his own medicine, suddenly stiffened. He slowly turned his head and stared at Xiaobao, asking, Little heir, you used that bottle of medicine? Xiaobao blinked innocently and said, It's the bottle that Mr. Shin just concocted last night. It's green. It's a beautiful little jade bottle. Shin Yang's body swayed. He quickly held onto the table and asked calmly, Is that what I gave to the little heir? I asked Mr. Shin if he could give the bottle to me. Mr. Shin nodded. Xiaobao asked, puzzled. Shin Yang was silent. You're asking about the bottle, but you're asking about the medicine too. Seeing that Shin Yang's expression was not right, Feng Jiao asked curiously, What medicine did Mr. Shin concoct? Is it very important? Mo Xiaobao smiled and said, I saw something written on Mr. Shin's small bottle. It said something about acacia or something spring. Pfft. On the other side, Han Mingxi spat out a mouthful of tea. He looked at Shin Yang in disbelief and said, It can't be the aphrodisiac, right? Mr. Shin, what are you using that for? As he spoke, he looked at Shin Yang with a gaze that said, You're already so old, yet you're still so interested. Han Mingxi lived up to his name as Mr. Feng Yu. He had been in the entertainment industry for many years and was naturally familiar with all kinds of strange medicines. Shin Yang's lips twitched. He rolled his eyes and said, What do you mean I'm using it for? A few days ago someone gave it to me to see if there's an antidote. Han Mingxi did not believe him. Who would research an antidote for this kind of medicine? Any normal person would know how to cure this kind of medicine. Han Mingxi looked at Shin Yang with an expression that said, I'd be a fool to believe you. Shin Yang also understood that the more he tried to explain, the worse the situation would become. He glared at Xiaobao with resentment. If it wasn't for this damned brat, he wouldn't have been mocked by a junior like Han Mingxi. Mo Xiaobao hid in Yi Li's arms and secretly glanced at Xinyang with a smirk. Yi Li helplessly patted Mo Xiaobao's little head and lightly coughed before asking, "Then, will this medicine have any side effects?" Han Mingxi giggled and said, "No, this is a top-grade medicine. Even if you had the money, you might not be able to get it. It was just that he was better at controlling time. Normally, it would only flare up after 2 hours, and once it did, it would be unstoppable. So, Junwei cough. Young Master Feng-san, it's best to get someone to prepare." Han Mingxi clearly sensed that this matter was not suitable for Yi Li to handle, so he could only change his tone and look at Feng Jiao. Feng Jiao rolled his eyes in annoyance. In his early years, he was also a person who had been through hundreds of flowers, so he naturally knew what the so-called aphrodisiac powder was. Mo Xiaobao looked at everyone and asked curiously, "What do we need to prepare?" Yi Li lightly flicked his forehead. "Children are not allowed to interrupt when adults are talking." Mo Xiaobao held his little forehead and looked pitifully at Yi Li sitting not far away. Zhuojing, who was busy handling files, frowned and raised his head to say, "Wang Fei right now? Prince Li seems to be in Genom of Gojoseon's courtyard." It had been exactly 2 hours since Mo Jingli had been bitten by Mo Xiaobao. Hearing this, everyone couldn't help but look at each other. After a while, Feng Jiao and Han Mingxi jumped up at the same time and rushed in the direction of Lei Jinting's courtyard. Of course, they weren't going to save people, they were going to watch the show. Han Mingyue raised her eyebrows and stood up to say, "Let's go take a look too. It wouldn't be good if Emperor Chu or Genom of Gojoseon were hurt." Mo Xiaobao excitedly kicked his little legs in Yi Li's arms and reached out his little hand to Han Mingyue. "I want to go too. I want to go too." Xinyang, who was at the side, pulled him over and said, "Little Shitzi, you should come with this old man to read the medicine manual in the study again. You should use any kind of medicine. You're not afraid of harming others or yourself." Yi Li nodded gratefully at Xinyang. She really didn't know how to explain this kind of medicine to Mo Xiaobao. With the guidance of the famous Dr. Xinyang, she believed that Mo Xiaobao would quickly understand what kind of medicine could be used and what should be used carefully. Yi Li, Han Mingyue, and Qin Feng leisurely walked towards the guest courtyard. Before they reached the entrance, they saw the servant girl who had been arranged to serve them rushing over with a pale face. Seeing Yi Li, she released a breath. "This servant greets Wang Fei." Yi Li nodded and asked, "What happened?" The servant girl's face was pale and her eyes were wide with fear as she said, "Wang Fei, quickly go take a look. Genom of Gojoseon is going to beat Emperor Chu to death." Everyone couldn't help but pause. Yi Li sighed and said, "Go take a look." Before they even entered the courtyard, there was a burst of noise coming from inside. Feng Jiao and Han Mingxi were sitting leisurely on the wall and excitedly watching. They even excitedly gesticulated from time to time. Yi Li sighed, "Feng-san, Mingxi. Were these two afraid that Lei Jinting didn't know how happy they were?" Feng Jiao and Mingxi lightly landed and said with a smile, "Wang Fei, don't worry. Genom of Gojoseon is about to go crazy from anger. He hasn't discovered us." Yi Li raised an eyebrow and asked, "What's going on inside?" She thought that Lei Jinting and Mo Jingli should be secretly plotting inside. Since they were going to be together sooner or later, Yi Li naturally didn't mind them plotting in their own place. It was better than running to a place that she didn't know and creating a situation that wasn't easy to control. However, even if the poison in Mo Jingli's body flared up, Lei Jinting would at most throw him out or find someone to help him deal with it. They wouldn't fight. Han Mingxi gave a low laugh and said, "It seems like Emperor Chu intended to be rude to Genom of Gojoseon. Also, after the poison flares up, the poisoned person will be several times stronger than normal." So, Yi Li couldn't help but twitch her lips. For the first time in her life, she felt her face turn green. Chapter 999. Yi Li could swear that she did not like Lei Jinting and Mo Jingli, who were trying to take advantage of the situation, but she had never thought of using this method to deal with them. Entering the guest courtyard and seeing the mess in front of her, Yi Li felt her forehead throbbing with pain. Seeing that Mo Jingli was indeed on the verge of death from Lei Jinting's beating, Yi Li hurriedly said, "Hurry and pull Emperor Chu out." If it was somewhere else, Yi Li wouldn't care if Lei Jinting wanted to beat Mo Jingli to death. but she couldn't let Emo Jingli die like this in the Prince Ding mansion. Feng Xiao looked up at the sky. Wang Fei, how can we stop Genom of Gojoseon? Even if Lei Jinting was missing a hand, he was still one of the top 4 experts in the world. Wouldn't they be looking for a beating if they rushed up? And it was for Emo Jingli. They definitely couldn't do it. Princess Ding, if something happens to His Majesty in the Prince Ding mansion. The people that Emo Jingli had brought with him were also anxious. Genom of Gojoseon was too powerful in Xiling. What was worse was that the emperor had suddenly attacked Genom of Gojoseon instead of anyone else. Han Mingyue raised an eyebrow and smiled faintly. Are you threatening the Prince Ding mansion? Genom of Gojoseon wants to fight with Emperor Chu. It has nothing to do with the Prince Ding mansion. Seeing that person speechless and blushing, Han Mingyue said leisurely, but Emperor Chu is a guest. The Prince Ding mansion will naturally ensure his safety. That person glanced at Emo Jingli, who had been beaten beyond recognition and was speechless. If this was called ensuring his safety, then he would rather not be safe. Genom of Gojoseon, Emperor Chu is the ruler of a country. Also, this is the Prince Ding mansion. Yili stepped forward and frowned slightly at the two. She said unhappily, if the two of you are here to pay homage to the prince, I welcome you. But if you have any personal grudges, please leave Feihong Pass and settle it yourself. Lei Jinting certainly would not kill Emo Jingli. If he killed Emo Jingli now, it would be a great help to the Prince Ding mansion. Hearing Yi Li's words, Lei Jinting snorted coldly and stopped his hand with a cold and solemn expression. But unexpectedly, as soon as he stopped, Emo Jingli, who had been beaten to the point of death, came back to life on the spot and entangled with him. Lei Jinting's expression stiffened. He kicked Emo Jingli out. Don't go, don't go. Emo Jingli, who was kicked out, muttered in a low voice while moaning. Everyone present had excellent hearing, so they naturally heard his words clearly. They looked at Lei Jinting, who had a livid expression on his face, with an embarrassed expression. After a long while, Feng Xiao came back to his senses. He muttered to himself in a low voice, so Emperor Chu is so deep in Yongqing. No wonder. Feng San. Lei Jinting was full of anger and had nowhere to vent it. He glanced at Feng Xiao and sent a palm strike over without saying anything. Feng Xiao quickly retreated. On the other side, Han Mingyue also sent a palm strike at Lei Jinting at the same time. Only then did Feng Xiao manage to avoid this palm strike. Genom of Gojoseon. Yili was displeased. She said in a low voice, Genom of Gojoseon, this is Feihong Pass. This consort hopes that Genom of Gojoseon will conduct himself with dignity. Lei Jinting took a deep breath. He knew that he couldn't do anything to Feng Xiao at this time. However, he couldn't bear the gazes of everyone present. Lei Jinting had been unhindered in his life. Even if there were times when he failed miserably, he had never been as embarrassed as he was now. He glared hatefully at Emo Jingli, who was being held down by an attendant at the side. Lei Jinting said in a low voice, I still have important matters to attend to in the army. I will take my leave first. Yili didn't stay any longer. As for the matter of peace that Lei Jinting mentioned before, neither side really took it to heart. She nodded and said, since that's the case, this consort won't keep Genom of Gojoseon any longer. Lung Air, send Genom of Gojoseon off for me. Among the few people present except for Han Mingyue, only Lung Haoyu was the most reliable. Han Mingyue didn't have a position in the prince's residence. Naturally, she couldn't let him send him off. If the medicine was given to Feng Xiao and Han Mingxi, Lei Jinting would be annoyed again. Lung Haoyu nodded and said to Lei Jinting, Genom of Gojoseon, please. Lei Jinting left with an ashen face. On the other side, Emo Jingli was still struggling under the suppression of the attendant. Yili was too lazy to look at this ugly appearance. She just ordered, send your majesty back to his room to rest. Do you need to call a doctor? The attendant beside Emo Jingli looked at Emo Jingli with some difficulty. People with discerning eyes naturally understood what was going on with Emo Jingli. Thank you, princess. No need. We have brought an imperial physician. Yili didn't care and only warned, please be careful with the people in this consort's residence. We understand. Everyone said. Princess Ding was warning them not to touch the maids in the general's residence. They originally brought a lot of maids with them. These people naturally didn't want to make things unpleasant with Princess Ding because of a few maidservants. After all, this was still the Prince Ding mansion's place. Thus they happily agreed. Seeing Emo Jingli's attendant carry him back, Feng Jiao and the others couldn't help but laugh out loud. Yili helplessly shook her head. Emo Xiaobao had hit the nail on the head this time. It was originally just a prank, but she didn't expect that it would end up like this. Feng Jiao waved his fan and said with a smile, I really didn't expect that Emperor Chu would be like this towards Genom of Gojoseon. It really can be said that they are deeply in love with each other. Everyone rolled their eyes. In any case, Feng Jiao was determined to pin this matter on Lei Zhenting and Emo Jingli. Be careful, Lei Zhenting sent people to kill you, Han Mingxi reminded. Joking was good, but playing with fire wasn't good. Feng Jiao gracefully said, unless he personally comes. If he doesn't come, what is this young master afraid of? Moreover, he won't have time to come in the next few days. More importantly, if he really wants to kill me because of this matter, doesn't that prove that my guess is true? That's why he wants to kill me, to silence me. Thus, on this day, a piece of news quickly spread throughout the entire Feihong Pass like wildfire. It also spread in all directions at an extremely fast speed. At first, it was like this. I heard that Emperor Chu accidentally offended Genom of Gojoseon and was beaten up by Genom of Gojoseon. Then it became like this. I heard that Emperor Chu has a crush on Genom of Gojoseon and couldn't help but offend Genom of Gojoseon and was beaten up by Genom of Gojoseon. Then it was like this. I heard that Emperor Chu's intentions were beaten up by Genom of Gojoseon. Then it was like this. I heard that Emperor Chu and Genom of Gojoseon couldn't help but fall in love. They couldn't help it, and were beaten up by Genom of Gojoseon. Finally it was, I heard that Emperor Chu was beaten up by Genom of Gojoseon. What do you think? You're really ignorant. Oh, could it be? Definitely. Thus, when Emo Jingli woke up the next day, the news had already swept through the entire Feihong Pass. Emo Jingli, who remembered what he did the day before, was also ashamed and angry, but there was nothing he could do. Chapter 1000. In the morning, Yili was sitting in a pavilion in the garden drinking tea. She was dressed in snow-white clothes, and her hair was casually pulled up without the slightest bit of makeup on her beautiful face. In the faint morning mist, there was a hint of melancholy and gloominess. Emo Jingli stood outside the pavilion and saw this beautiful picture. He couldn't help but become distracted. His face had been beaten black and blue yesterday. Normally, with Emo Jingli's personality, he would not have come out. But right now, he did not have the time to wait until the wounds on his face healed before coming out to see people. Therefore, early in the morning, he could only look at the servants of the generals Fu strangely to see Yili. Wang Fei, Emperor Chu has come. Qin Feng walked into the pavilion and said in a low voice. Yili nodded and said, invite Emperor Chu in. Qin Feng turned to invite Emo Jingli in, but Qin Feng himself did not leave. Instead, he stood in the pavilion not 3 steps away from Yili. His gaze was undisguised as he stared at Emo Jingli. His gaze was filled with warning and wariness. Emo Jingli's expression darkened. But because of the wounds on his face, people could not see it. Qin Feng and Yili only saw his face twist strangely. Yili raised a teacup to her lips to hide the twitch and smile at the corner of her lips. She asked in a low voice, is Emperor Chu's wounds serious? Not serious. Emo Jingli gritted his teeth and said. He himself did not feel anything at the time yesterday's events, but he remembered it clearly when he thought about it. Thinking about how he had thrown himself at an old man, Emo Jingli immediately felt his stomach twist. He felt like he was going to throw up the breakfast he had eaten this morning. In fact, when he woke up in the middle of the night, he had already vomited once. Emo Jingli knew that he had definitely been plotted against, but neither he nor the accompanying imperial physicians could understand how he had been plotted against. Other than being bitten by Emo Xiaobao on this day, Emo Jingli did not come within 2 steps of anyone who was not by his side. Even the tea and desserts they drank were strictly inspected. Thus, no matter what, Emo Jingli could not figure out how he had fallen for it. Yili nodded and said, it's good that you're fine. Genom of Gojoseon was too impulsive. Yesterday afternoon, Genom of Gojoseon left Feihong Pass. So if you want to settle accounts with someone, go find Lei Zhenting yourself. Emo Jingli was certain that he did not want to see Lei Zhenting again for the next year. Not only because he was used to vomiting but also because of the harm that Lei Zhenting had caused him. Jin came to find you. Emo Jingli stared at Yili and said. Yili nodded, Emperor Chu, if you have something to say, please say it. Emo Jingli glanced at Qin Feng at the side and said with a frown, You can leave first. Qin Feng ignored him and just glanced at him. Mo Jingli strangely understood the meaning of Qin Feng's gaze. You even threw yourself at a man who knows what you will do to our Wang Fei. Seeing this, the blue veins on Mo Jingli's forehead jumped, but he saw that Yi Li did not mean to dismiss Qin Feng at all. He had to suppress the anger in his heart and said, Zhen has something to discuss with you. Yi Li smiled and said, Emperor Chu, please say it. You and the Prince Ding mansion submit to the De Chu state. I promise that Mo Yuchen will still be the hereditary Prince Ding. Mo Jingli said matter-of-factly, and his superior tone even had a hint of charity. It was just that his originally domineering appearance was a little funny because of his appearance at this time. Yi Li glanced at him speechlessly and said indifferently, if I didn't guess wrong, Emperor Chu should have reached an agreement with Genom of Gojoseon of West Hill, right? Mo Jingli sneered indifferently and said, Enchanting can fool me, but do I have to abide by the agreement? Yi Li, as long as you and the Prince Ding mansion submit to the De Chu state, I promise that I will treat you well. How does Emperor Chu plan to not treat this consort unfairly? Yi Li raised her brows and asked. It couldn't be that Mo Jingli's brain was completely blank, right? Did he really think that if she said she would submit to the De Chu state, the entire Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army would obediently submit to the De Chu state? Thinking that Yi Li was moved, Mo Jingli smiled with satisfaction and said confidently, I can make you empress. Yi Li, you should know that making a married woman empress is something that has never happened before. It is enough to prove my sincerity. Yi Li lowered her eyes and remained silent. Mo Jingli was not in a rush. This kind of thing naturally needed to be considered. He had absolute confidence that Yi Li would agree to his request. Mo Shuyao was already dead. No matter how strong Yi Li was, she was still a woman. Without a man supporting her, she was nothing. After a while, Yi Li softly said, this consort needs time to think. Mo Jingli nodded and said, all right, I will wait for your reply. Yi Li nodded and left with Qin Feng. In the garden, Qin Feng followed beside Yi Li. He asked in confusion, Princess, are you really considering this kind of thing? Yi Li nodded and said, of course I need to think about it. I'm thinking about how to deal with Mo Jingli. What plans does Princess have? Qin Feng asked curiously. Yi Li thought for a moment and said softly, throw him out. Watching Yi Li walk away, Qin Feng blinked and snapped his fingers. 4 Qi Lin appeared in front of Qin Feng. Qin Feng raised his eyebrows and asked, do you understand what Princess said? What does Princess mean? Qin Feng smiled and said, it's the literal meaning. Throw him out. A quarter of an hour later, a man dressed in imperial court robes but with a bloody nose and swollen face was thrown down from the tower of Feihong Pass. Feng Jiao, who was playing chess on the tower, shook his head regretfully and said, Qi Lin is getting worse and worse. He doesn't even know how to throw a person. If it was him, he would have hit his pressure points and thrown him down. He would have guaranteed that Mo Jingli's face would never have such a difficult expression again. Han Mingyue said with a smile, there's someone down there. There was also a large group of guards that Mo Jingli had brought with him outside the city. How could they let Mo Jingli fall to his death? Qi Lin clearly knew how to throw. Even though 3 palace guards had jumped up to catch Mo Jingli still paid the price of a broken right hand. If it had been a little more serious, the right side of his body would have been permanently paralyzed. Yi Li, Zhen will not let you go. Outside the city, Mo Jingli roared angrily. So, a chess piece shot down from the tower and headed straight for Mo Jingli's open mouth. The guards that had been waiting cautiously were startled by the emperor's sudden roar and didn't have time to block this hidden weapon attack. Han Mingyue elegantly wiped her hands with a handkerchief. After Mo Jingli became the emperor, he became even more rude. Mingyu Gongzi has good skills. Feng Jiao praised with a face full of smiles. The two looked at each other and smiled. They watched as Mo Jingli cursed and left. Chapter 1001. On a mountain road leading from Dechu State to Xiling, Ling Taihan and the other two were leisurely riding their own horses. Although the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce had suffered heavy losses this time, Ling Taihan already had thoughts of retiring, so it wasn't an important matter. If he was still around, it would be a huge problem as to who would be in charge of the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce in the future. After all, an assassin organization was different from other organizations. If they didn't use the right people, it could cause a lot of trouble. Just as Ling Taihan was talking and laughing with his two younger siblings, he suddenly frowned. Without waiting for Leng Luiyue and Sickly Scholar to speak, Ling Taihan said in a deep voice, "Back off." Although Leng Luiyue and Sickly Scholar didn't understand what their brother meant, they still obediently rode their horses to the other side when they saw his serious expression. "Prince Ding, since you're here, why don't you come out and meet us?" Ling Taihan said in a clear voice. Standing not far away, Leng Luiyue and Sickly Scholar were shocked. On their way here, the news of Prince Ding's death had already spread all over the world. But Big Brother. Just as the two of them were worrying, a white-robed figure appeared on a small col on the mountain path. His clothes were as white as snow and his hair was as white as frost. Emo Shuyao held the incineration sword in his hand and stared indifferently at Ling Taihan on horseback. He didn't seem to be surprised that Ling Taihan knew that he wasn't dead. Ling Taihan sighed helplessly and said, "Prince Ding, please." Emo Shuyao didn't bother with pleasantries. A cold light streaked across the sky, and the incineration sword was instantly unsheathed. With an overwhelming murderous aura, it pressed down on Ling Taihan. Ling Taihan patted his horse and leaped into the air. At the same time, he unsheathed his sword and sent out a powerful sword chi towards Emo Shuyao. The impact caused by the collision of the two sword energies caused the two of them to involuntarily take a dozen steps back before they could stabilize their footing. However, wherever the sword energies passed, the trees were uniformly cut down. With a crisp sound, the iron sword in Ling Taihan's hand broke. Ling Taihan's sword was also a 1 in 1,000 good swords, but compared to the legendary sword in Emo Shuyao's hand, it was still far inferior. Therefore it was not surprising that it was broken into several pieces after the collision. Emo Shuyao had always disdained using divine weapons to bully others, but this time he didn't seem to care at all. Not to mention Ling Taihan's sword, even if Ling Taihan was bare-handed, he would still be able to sweep the incineration sword at him. This also made Ling Taihan understand that Emo Shuyao was extremely angry because he had attacked Yi Li, Big Brother. Leng Luiyue couldn't help but exclaim. She raised her hand and wanted to throw her weapon over. Leng Luiyue specialized in hidden weapons, but she wasn't proficient in swords and sabers. However, because of this, Ling Taihan had prepared good weapons for his two sisters-in-law. The sword in Leng Luiyue's hand was far better than Ling Taihan's own sword. However, no matter how strong a sword was, it was useless against the incineration sword, so Ling Taihan waved his hand and rejected Leng Luiyue's sword. Emo Shuyao pointed his sword at Ling Taihan and said calmly, "I have always treated Pavilion Master Ling as a rare opponent, but I have never treated Pavilion Master Ling as someone I wanted to kill. If I make an exception today, I will definitely regret it." Ling Taihan smiled bitterly and said helplessly, "I also never thought that I would meet Prince Ding in a life-and-death battle. However, there are many things in this world that must be done." Emo Shuyao snorted and didn't say anything else. The incineration sword in his hand emitted a cold light and shot towards Ling Taihan. He didn't want to know what kind of difficulties he had to face. To Emo Shuyao, anyone who attacked Yi Li deserved to die. There was no reason, no right or wrong. On the mountain path, the two figures quickly engaged in a fierce battle. Even with Leng Luiyue's and Sickly Scholar's martial arts, they could only see two shadows swaying in the air, and a suffocating murderous aura that filled the air. The sword energy that shot out from time to time turned everything it touched into dust. Leng Luiyue nervously grabbed Sickly Scholar's wrist and stared anxiously at the place where they couldn't see clearly. Sickly Scholar wasn't having a good time either. Originally, he had recovered from his illness, but just now, the suffocating murderous aura made him want to cough again. "Big Brother." Just as the two were panicking, Ling Taihan's voice suddenly fell from the sky. Sickly Scholar quickly jumped up and caught Ling Taihan's falling body. Leng Luiyue gritted her teeth and pulled out her sword and rushed towards Emo Shuyao. "Second sister, stop!" Ling Taihan cried out, "Prince Ding, have mercy!" Peng! Leng Luiyue's sword only had half of it left. Emo Shuyao raised his hand and the broken sword tip shot towards Leng Luiyue. Leng Luiyue continuously retreated and finally couldn't help but fall to the ground. The sword tip flew past her face and nailed into the tree behind her. Leng Luiyue sat on the ground and was sweating profusely. Just now, she clearly felt the coldness of the sword tip when it flew past her face. Emo Shuyao looked down at everyone from above. His eyes were cold and emotionless, like a god in the sky. "You overestimate yourself." Lung Luiyue stubbornly stared at Emo Xiuyao and sternly said, "My big brother didn't kill Princess Ding. Prince Ding's actions are too much." Emo Xiuyao sneered, "Yes, I didn't kill her. If Princess Li was hurt in the slightest, I will chop up your Yanwang chamber and feed them to the dogs." Perhaps because she was angered by Emo Jingli's attitude, Lung Luiyue forgot her fear and sneered, "My big brother really wanted to kill Yili. Do you think Yili is still alive?" The Yanwang chamber was an assassin and Ling Taihan was the only assassin in the world. If he really wanted to kill Yili, how could he let her escape? Even if it was because he didn't want to offend the Prince Ding mansion, Ling Taihan did show mercy. "Luiyue." Ling Taihan frowned and said in a low voice. Lung Luiyue could only reluctantly shut her mouth. Ling Taihan slowly stood up. He had stopped for a moment just now and had adjusted his breathing. Although his injuries were serious, it wasn't to the extent that he didn't have the strength to fight back. Ling Taihan looked at Emo Xiuyao and said, "Prince Ding, I still have some matters to attend to. I'm sure Prince Ding also has urgent matters to attend to. Once I've finished my matters, I'll naturally give Prince Ding an explanation. When the time comes, you and I will fight to the death. How about it? Besides, Master Prince Ding isn't completely unharmed, right? If I go all out, do you think Prince Ding will be able to escape unscathed?" Emo Xiuyao was silent for a moment, then said, "Very good. In 3 months I will come to find Pavilion Master Ling again." Ling Taihan nodded, "I'll be waiting for you at any time. Goodbye." Emo Xiuyao didn't say anything else. Ling Taihan brought Lung Luiyue and Ling Taihan back onto their horses and left. "Prince." A black-clothed guard appeared in front of Emo Xiuyao and called out in a low voice, "No matter." Emo Xiuyao said indifferently. He raised his hand and wiped it. A trace of blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. Chapter 1002. Prince. Emo Xiuyao waved his hand, wiping the blood from his lips. Ling Taihan really lives up to his reputation. Although it seemed like he had the upper hand with Emo Xiuyao's insight, how could he not see that Ling Taihan was deliberately showing weakness? Moreover, although Ling Taihan was heavily injured, his internal injuries were not light either. Just as Ling Taihan said, if he used all his strength, the final outcome of the two of them would probably be who would die more miserably. He had no intention of dying together with Ling Taihan. "Prince, do you want to?" The guard beside him whispered. The Yanwang Chamber of Commerce was almost completely destroyed, and Ling Taihan was heavily injured. They only needed to send people to follow up, and it was not impossible to catch Ling Taihan and his group in one fell swoop. Emo Xiuyao shook his head. "Forget it, we'll talk about it later." Lung Luiyue said that Ling Taihan had shown mercy to Li and he believed it. At their level, if they wanted to sneak attack someone unless it was an expert of the same level, it was very difficult to escape. Of course, Emo Xiuyao also calculated that Ling Taihan would definitely not go against the Prince Ding mansion for Enchanting, but he did not expect that Ling Taihan would actually make a move. Even if Li was not injured, he could not pretend that it did not happen. Ling Taihan is still useful. Later, send a letter to Ling Taihan for Emo Xiuyao said. "Yes. Prince, Commander Emo has a secret letter." A shadow guard appeared in front of Emo Xiuyao, presenting a letter with both hands. Emo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows, took the letter and opened it. But in an instant his expression changed. "Emo Jingli, I will make you beg for death." The two shadow guards standing beside him took a step back, secretly praying for the person who had angered the prince. Emo Xiuyao stared at the letter in his hand, his expression sinister. "You want to make Li Empress? I want you to be unable to be the emperor. Let's see what you have to be the empress." Guards. After a while, Emo Xiuyao crushed the letter in his hand into powder and threw it out. "Prince, please give your orders." A shadow guard in black appeared behind Emo Xiuyao, bowing and waiting for orders. Emo Xiuyao said lightly, "Let Emo Hua take Ai's token and go to Nanjing personally. Let him tell the Empress Dowager that the Emperor of Dechu State can be changed. I guarantee that Emo Jingli will not go back to trouble her." This subordinate obeys. The shadow guard glanced at Emo Xiuyao's gloomy face, quickly took the order and flew away. Prince was in a bad mood now, whoever bumped into him would be unlucky. On the third day after Lei Jinting left Feihong Pass, the flames of war that had just stopped for a few days were ignited again. Perhaps because they had confirmed the news of Emo Xiuyao's death, the Xiling army was no longer as cautious as before when they fought with Mo Xiuyao. Instead, the entire army advanced together, only rushing towards Feihong Pass. On the other side, the Dechu state's reinforcements that Mo Jingli had brought to reinforce Hanggu Pass also bypassed Hanggu Pass, took Yuming Pass and only headed northwest. They quickly blocked the only road from Chujing and Hanggu Pass to Feihong Pass and occupied Liang City in Yunzhou. Liang was the only way to Feihong Pass from Chujing, and it was also the original location of the Su family in Yunzhou. 10 years ago, after the Su family moved to the northwest, the current most prominent family in Liang was the Su family, which was related to the Chu clan by marriage. Unfortunately, although Mo Jingli was the emperor of Dechu state, his arrival was not welcomed by the people of Yunzhou and Liang. Even the prominent families in Yunzhou closed their doors and ignored Mo Jingli. This made Mo Jingli, who had been complacent, suffer a setback. If it wasn't for the fact that he still had a shred of rationality left, he would have long executed all of these aristocratic families. On the other hand, Lei Zhenting's Xiling army was not going well either. The Mahist army, led by Murong Shen and several famous generals, scattered and sneaked in, causing trouble for the Xiling army everywhere. Although Murong Shen and Marquis Nan were not as good as Lei Zhenting in terms of military strategy and military strength, it was not difficult for them to make trouble and hold back the advance of the Xiling army. Especially when they were leaving Feihong Pass, they had just received the 16-word proverb personally taught by Princess Ding: "When the enemy advances, I retreat. When the enemy retreats, I chase. When the enemy stays, I disturb. When the enemy is tired, I fight." These were all veterans who had fought on the battlefield for many years, so naturally they quickly mastered it. Lei Zhenting was so depressed that he felt as if he had swallowed a fly and felt nauseous. He could not spit it out and felt uncomfortable swallowing it. In the Xiling army, Lei Zhenting stared coldly at the map in front of him. The news of Mo Xiuyao's death and the good news that they were about to defeat the Mahist army could not make him feel happy and joyful at all. He glanced at Lei Tingfeng, who was wearing a battle robe and looking tired, and asked in a low voice, "How many more days until we reach Feihong Pass?" Lei Tingfeng said, "Originally our army would be able to reach Feihong Pass in 3 days. But no. I'm afraid it will take at least half a month. Father, now that Mo Xiuyao is dead, we don't need to rush. Should we clean up the weeds first?" As long as Mo Xiuyao was dead, the Mahist army would be leaderless. As long as there was time, the West Hill would eventually defeat the Mahist army. So Lei Tingfeng really did not understand why his father was in a hurry. But there was still the threat of Murong Shen and Marquis Nan behind him. Lei Zhenting shook his head and said, "We don't have time, Father." Lei Tingfeng raised his eyebrows in confusion. Lei Zhenting smiled bitterly and said, "Mo Xiuyao's death is a good thing for the West Hill. But, for the Jinnan Palace, it may not be a good thing at this time. My son is dull." Lei Tingfeng lowered his head and said in confusion. Lei Zhenting sighed and said, "Tingfeng, the Jinnan Palace is not the direct descendant of the Emperor of Xiling. There is still another emperor in An City. The Emperor of Xiling did not have much ability, but he was not an idiot. All these years he was just pretending to be crazy and stupid." Lei Tingfeng frowned and said, "The Emperor? What can he do? The West Hill is under my father's control." Lei Zhenting shook his head and said, "How powerful was the Prince Ding mansion back then? But it was almost destroyed by Mo Jingli, who even you looked down on. Isn't that enough to teach you a lesson?" "Father, what do you mean?" Lei Tingfeng said in surprise. Lei Zhenting smiled bitterly. Originally, with Mo Xiuyao as a strong enemy, the Emperor of Xiling naturally had some scruples. Who said that the Emperor of Xiling was completely mediocre? All these years, Lei Zhenting had been responsible for all the affairs of the West Hill and worked himself to death. But the high and mighty master of the West Hill was still the Emperor of Xiling. Now Mo Xiuyao was dead and Lei Zhenting was fighting outside. It was the best time for the Emperor of Xiling to seize power. Lei Tingfeng frowned. He had never thought highly of his uncle sitting on the throne. But at the same time he also understood that for the muddle-headed and incompetent Emperor of Xiling to be able to sit on the throne steadily for so many years, it was a kind of ability in itself. After all, the Jinnan Palace was not the Prince Ding mansion of the past, which was truly dedicated to assisting the royal family. But if they were not careful, the Prince Ding mansion of the past would become a lesson for the Jinnan Palace. Chapter 1003. Father, please punish your son for his thoughtlessness. Lei Tingfeng lowered his head and begged for forgiveness. Lei Jinting waved his hand and smiled. Forget it. I know that you have been troubled by Murong Shen and the others these past few days, but you are right. We can't go on like this. I will leave you 200,000 soldiers. Will you be able to cover our retreat? Lei Tingfeng's spirit was shaken. He replied in a clear voice, Father, I will not disappoint you. Lei Jinting nodded. Father believes you, but you must be careful. As long as you can stop them, there is no need to rush to kill them. The Mahist army suddenly changed their tactics this time. There must be an expert behind the scenes. Lei Tingfeng frowned. Expert? Other than Mo Shuyao, there is an expert in the Mahist army that even Father is helpless against? Lei Jinting pondered for a moment. He sighed with a complicated expression. If I am not wrong, it should be Yi Li. Other than her, the Mahist army is made up of generals who have killed their way out of the battlefield. They would not have such a bold and imaginative way of fighting. Lei Jinting did not know how to evaluate Yi Li. From his perspective, Yi Li could not be considered a peerless talent. However, it was precisely this kind of woman who always had astonishing achievements that no one could have imagined. It was only when he studied her tactics that Lei Jinting realized that every single one of Yi Li's tactics could only be described with one word. Unexpected. Because it was unexpected, it could not be replicated. This kind of tactic required a bold and imaginative mind and extraordinary courage. Of course, Lei Jinting would never have thought that Yi Li had such tactics. It was not because she had a bold and imaginative mind or a strange talent. It was because she had more than 1,000 years of experience in military training than them. A true genius would definitely be able to create a domain that belonged to him or her. Yi Li, on the other hand, was still far from reaching that level. Lei Tingfeng nodded solemnly and said, Rest assured, Father. Tingfeng will not act blindly without thinking. Lei Tingfeng, who was in his 30s, had long passed his youthful and frivolous days. He knew what was important and what was not. Therefore, he would never ruin his father's entire plan for the sake of a momentary victory. Lei Jinting nodded and said, Imperial Father is naturally at ease with you. Forget it, go and prepare. Tonight I will lead the troops and set out. Yes, Royal Father, take care. Tingfeng will take his leave. Feihong Pass. Reporting to Wang Fei, Genom of Gojoseon and Lei Jinting are leading 700,000 soldiers towards Feihong Pass. In the generals Fu Yili and Han Mingyue, who were playing chess, stopped their game. Yili smiled faintly and said, They are finally here. Han Mingyue slowly put the chess pieces back into the box at the side and said with a smile, Wang Fei doesn't seem to be nervous at all. Yili smiled slightly and said, Nervousness will only cause people to make wrong judgments. Other than that, there is no benefit. Also, this is something that we already knew, isn't it? Han Mingyue raised an eyebrow and smiled without speaking. He had always been curious about where Yi Li's bottom line was. But it seemed that no matter what happened, she could not truly break down and feel fear. Wang Fei's mind is so firm that even a man would be ashamed of his inferiority. Yi Li shook her head and said with a smile, Actually, a woman's endurance and ability to endure is much higher than a man's, but it was just that the women of this era were bound by etiquette and were raised in their boudoirs. It was to the point that they could only scream uncontrollably or even faint when encountering a small matter. Han Mingyue said with a smile, Seeing Wang Fei, this one believes these words. Yi Li grimaced helplessly. She had been forced to do this, all right? At this time, if even she panicked, the entire Feihong Pass would immediately fall into chaos. Looking at Yi Li's calm and beautiful face, Han Mingyue asked, In at most 2 days, Lei Jinting's army will reach the gates. What does Wang Fei plan? Yi Li raised an eyebrow and said with a faint smile, How about giving him a big gift first before talking about the plan? This one will wait and see, Han Mingyue said with a smile. 2 days later, less than 10 li away from Feihong Pass, the Xiling army's morale was high and they were unstoppable. Seeing the distant Feihong Pass, Lei Jinting, who was walking at the front, finally showed a hint of a smile. As long as they took Feihong Pass, there would be no more passes to defend in the northwest. Without Mo Shuyao, the Mahist army that had been sent out would be leaderless. At that time, Yi Li, would you regret it? Prince, this place is less than 10 li away from Feihong Pass. Should we set up camp here? A general who had been scouting ahead came back on his horse and bowed his hand to report. Lei Jinting raised an eyebrow and looked at the front. The terrain was open and flat. There was only a lone mountain in the southwest. Even though it was not easy to defend, but at the same time in this flat land, it would be difficult for the enemy to launch a surprise attack. Even though Lei Jinting did not think that Yi Li would be able to divert troops to launch a surprise attack, they had to be on guard. Nodding, Lei Jinting said, "Let's set up camp here. Prepare for the attack tomorrow morning." The subordinate obeys. The deputy general left and ordered the entire army to set up camp. On the lone mountain not far away, Yi Li led Feng Jiao and the others to a hidden spot on the cliff and looked at the Shilling army that was setting up camp at the foot of the mountain. Looking at the densely packed soldiers and horses, Han Mingxi could not help but sigh. There must be 700,000 to 800,000 people. Are we really going to defend Feihong Pass to the death? Feihong Pass did not even have 300,000 people. Feng Jiao glanced at him and said, "Unless young Master Feng, you can think of a place that is easier to defend and harder to attack than Feihong Pass." Once the Shilling army entered Feihong Pass, there would be no need to defend it anymore. All the way to Glass City was flat land. Even Glass City could not be considered impregnable. Glass City was originally a city that was not very big in the northwest. Even though it had been 10 years, its defense was still lacking compared to the Emperor of Shilling City and the Chu capital. Han Mingxi shrugged indifferently. In any case, he didn't do anything on the battlefield. He was just complaining casually. "Wang Fei, what are we looking at here? To see how many soldiers Lei Jinting brought?" Feng Jiao was also curious. Wang Fei said that she wanted to prepare a big gift for Lei Jinting's army. But he really did not know what Wang Fei had prepared that they had to come here to see it. Yi Li glanced at the Shilling army that was setting up camp and sighed helplessly. "This is not a good place, but there is no choice." "Qin Feng, are you ready?" Qin Feng, who was standing behind Yi Li, nodded and said, "Wang Fei, please do not worry. I have already prepared it." "Very good. Do it. Very soon Lei Jinting will send people up the mountain." Yi Li nodded and said, "Yes." Qin Feng waved his hand and hundreds of black cloud cavalry appeared on the cliff. They held bows and arrows in their hands and aimed at the army camp at the foot of the mountain. Feng Jiao couldn't help but roll his eyes. "Princess consort, you're not planning to use these 100 or so people to greet Lei Jinting, are you? Not to mention whether or not they could hit the target from such a long distance. Even if they did, how much power would they have? Even if these 100 people were to fight 800,000 people, these black cloud cavalry would not be able to kill many people even if they foamed at the mouth." Chapter 1004. Yi Li smiled and said, "You just have to watch carefully. Shoot." Whoosh! The black arrows shot toward the West Hill military camp after they left the bowstring. The Shilling army was also made up of elites. As soon as they heard the sound of arrows piercing through the air, they immediately reacted. Enemy attack. In a moment, the entire army was on alert. However, no matter how fast the West Hill soldiers reacted, they were not as fast as the arrows that had already left the bowstring. Soon they realized that the black arrows were not aimed at them, but at the open ground or the haystack tents. While everyone was still confused, Lei Jinting, who had been fighting for a long time, instinctively felt a trace of danger. He shouted, "Retreat!" Boom! Before his voice died away, there was an earth-shattering explosion, followed by a series of loud explosions and a strong smell of gunpowder in the military camp that had not yet been completely set up. At the same time, there were the screams of countless soldiers. The continuous explosion lasted for almost half an hour before it gradually subsided. Because of the thick smoke caused by the explosion, Lei Jinting stood up with a dusty face. What he saw was countless broken limbs in front of him. It was a mess. Many soldiers were killed by the explosion. The unlucky ones were even blown apart. But more people were seriously injured by the explosion. They were missing limbs and lying on the ground in pain. The soldiers who were lucky enough not to be injured were also frightened. Some timid ones even fell to the ground and cried for their parents. It was not that the West Hill soldiers were too calm, but that no one had ever seen such a terrifying power. If someone had carefully paid attention to the details of the battle when the Mahist army took over the Chu capital, they might have been prepared. But in that battle, the Mahist army used very little explosives and did not cause too many casualties. And after that, the news was tightly sealed. Even the Mahist army's own soldiers did not know much, let alone the West Hill people. Everyone on the cliff stared at the scene in front of them, stunned. After a long while, Feng Jiao squeezed out a sentence from his throat. So powerful. Feng Jiao had actually seen these things in the Chu capital, but Feng Jiao did not admire them very much. Because that thing was very troublesome to transport and its size was not small. More importantly, its lethality wasn't that special. But this time the feeling it gave him was enough to shock him. Yili looked at the miserable situation at the foot of the mountain and lowered her eyes in silence. Yili. At the foot of the mountain, Enchanting couldn't help but roar when he saw the tragic scene in front of him. His gaze shot towards the people on the cliff like lightning, accurately locating Yili's position. Enchanting was infuriated. In the explosion just now, the Shilling army had lost more than tens of thousands of soldiers. However, this was nothing to Enchanting, who currently had over 700,000 soldiers. However, the Mahist army had caused such great damage to the West Hill without losing a single soldier. For the Shilling army, the consequences and impact were definitely not as simple as losing tens of thousands of soldiers and horses. Enchanting jumped up and pounced towards Yili and the others. While in the air, Enchanting swung his sword, sending out a sharp sword aura towards Yili. Han Mingyue and Feng Jiao moved forward at the same time, blocking the sword aura. At the same time, over 100 Black Cloud cavalry aimed their bows at Enchanting and fired. Enchanting was in the air and had nowhere to borrow strength. If he didn't want to become a porcupine, he could only give up on attacking Yili and retreat. However, in his fury, Enchanting swung his sword and actually knocked down over 100 arrows at the same time. His sword didn't slow down at all as it swept towards Yili again. After missing, the Black Cloud cavalry didn't panic and continued to shoot. Feng Jiao, Qin Feng, Han Mingyue and the others all laid down in front of Yili, in case the Black Cloud cavalry couldn't stop Enchanting and they had to protect Yili. The only one who couldn't interfere was Han Mingxi. He stood by Yili's side and saw Yili take out an extremely strange object from her sleeve and fiddle with it a few times. Then he saw Yili raise that object forward and say in a low voice, "Feng-san, move aside." Feng Jiao, who was standing in front of Yili, was stunned and reflexively moved to the side. There was a loud bang. Feng Jiao only felt a gust of wind shoot past him. Even though Enchanting, who was originally incomparably ferocious in the air, stopped and then slowly fell down. Feng Jiao clearly saw a streak of blood blossom on Enchanting's shoulder, but he didn't see the arrow that shot him. Of course, Feng Jiao also dared to guarantee that not a single arrow hit Enchanting. Everyone turned around to look at the white-clothed girl behind them in shock. They saw that Yili was still holding that object. That object looked extremely strange and there was a small black hole. However, even people like Feng Jiao and Han Mingxi, who were experienced and knowledgeable, couldn't tell what kind of hidden weapon it was. They only felt that even though this object didn't look good, when Yili held it in her hand, it seemed to have a different kind of elegant killing intent. More importantly, it was this unremarkable object that injured Western Tomb's Genom of Gojoseon, one of the 4 great experts in the world, Enchanting. What is this? Yili frowned and helplessly sighed. Looking at the pistol in her hand, she sighed and said, "I actually missed." Unfortunately, this was the best pistol that could be made at the moment and it couldn't be mass-produced. This was a single-shot pistol, and its effective range was only 150 meters. Enchanting's Qinggong was too good, and she didn't even have the chance to use a rifle. However, compared to the last time she saw it, at least its lethality and stability had improved significantly. It was no longer just a toy that looked funny. What would have happened if you hadn't missed? In Han Mingxi's view, the fact that over 100 Black Cloud cavalry couldn't hit Enchanting and were shot down by Yili was already an incredible result. Yili smiled and said, "I originally thought that I would be able to hit his head 100%. You want to shoot Enchanting's head through?" Everyone was shocked. Yili shook her head and said, "This gun's penetrative power isn't strong. It can't pierce through from such a distance." It was also terrifying that it couldn't pierce through. Imagine an expert like Enchanting with a hole in the middle of his head. Everyone's gaze towards Yili could already be described as horrified. No, it should be said that they were looking at the object in Yili's hand. This was definitely the best hidden weapon in the world. Chapter 1005. Ignoring the curious gazes of the people, Yili calmly put the pistol in her hand back into her sleeve. She said with a smile, "We should go. If we don't go now, we will be surrounded." Everyone looked down at the Shilling soldiers who were already running towards them. They decisively packed up and left. The mountain path was on the other side. They had already prepared horses at the foot of the mountain. By the time those people came around, they had already ridden away. Leaving the cliff, everyone rode fast. They only sighed in relief when they reached the foot of Feihong Pass. Feng Jiao couldn't help but laugh out loud. The others also had carefree smiles on their faces. Ever since Mo Xiaoyao had disappeared, while the entire army was still in order, they could not help but feel a thread of unease. Naturally, they could not express some depression. Today was the most carefree day in recent days. Han Mingyue looked at Yi Li and asked in a low voice, "Wang Fei, can you lend me your hidden weapon to play with?" Hidden weapon? Yi Li raised an eyebrow and casually took out the pistol and handed it over. Han Mingyue carefully took it after giving her thanks. She could not wait to return to the Fu and looked at it as she walked. Beside her, Feng Jiao and Han Mingxi also stretched their necks. But for these things they were far less knowledgeable than Han Mingyue. Naturally, they were not in a hurry to steal it. Only Qin Feng, who had been following Yi Li, did not show any surprise. He had not only seen these things before but also knew where they came from. Naturally, he did not have the curiosity of the others. But after seeing the lethality that Wang Fei used today, he was eager to try. Han Mingyue frowned and thought. Her hand kept touching the thing in her hand. She even copied Yi Li and held it in her hand, trying to figure out where the mechanism was. Facing the black muzzle of the gun, Feng Jiao was so scared that he broke out in cold sweat. Although he didn't know what it was, he didn't forget that the thing that injured Enchanting definitely came from that small black hole. He quickly dodged to the side and said, "Han Mingyue, be careful." Han Mingyue raised his eyebrows with a smile and said, "It's useless." He already knew where the mechanism was, but when he pulled it, nothing shot out. Han Mingyue also knew that this was not the time to talk about this, so she did not ask Yi Li. She just played with it in her hands. As soon as they entered the residence, Han Mingyue immediately stuffed the pistol back into Yi Li's hands. Everyone else also looked at her eagerly. Yi Li smiled faintly. She stuffed a black magazine into the pistol, opened the safety and fired a shot into the sky. With a bang, a sparrow fell from the sky. Everyone looked and saw 2 bloody holes on the small sparrow's body. It was clear that the hidden weapon had passed through the sparrow's body and directly penetrated it. Good stuff. Han Mingyue praised. Although with their level of martial arts, even a stone wouldn't be a problem for them to fight sparrows. Han Mingyue could also see that the hidden weapon's speed was much faster than normal hidden weapons. It was even faster than the arrows of the Black Cloud Cavalry's best archers. More importantly, this kind of hidden weapon didn't require the user's skills or body condition. As long as it was accurate, it was fine. Yi Li shook her head and said, "It's too loud." They couldn't find any advanced weapons, and things like silencers couldn't be found in a short period of time. So if they wanted to attack at night, this thing wasn't as useful as a bow. However, Yi Li's eyes flashed with a trace of nostalgia. When she had just recovered her memories, she had never imagined that she would encounter this thing again. Even in her previous life, this could be sent to a museum as an antique. "Princess, can this one try?" Han Mingyue asked. Young Master Mingyu was very knowledgeable and naturally had a great interest in the unknown. Yi Li casually handed it over. Han Mingyue looked around and then pulled the trigger at a lantern hanging under the eaves. After a bang, the lantern was still in its original position. Instead, the bullet embedded itself into the wall. Ha ha ha. Feng Jiao couldn't help but laugh out loud. Han Mingyue, could it be that you've become rusty these past few years? Han Mingyue was very smart and knew where the problem was with just one try. She didn't say anything and handed the gun to Feng Jiao with a smile. Young Master Feng is also a famous archer. Why don't you try? Feng Jiao didn't care at all. I'll try. Bang. The white lantern was still swaying in the wind. Feng Jiao's face immediately distorted. Yi Li took the gun and smiled faintly. This indeed doesn't require internal energy and it doesn't require a strong body. However, there is still a little bit of recoil. So, if you want to practice it well, you still need to put in some effort. Did these people really think that just because they were good at throwing concealed weapons, they could shoot with precision the first time they touched a gun? Junwei, our friendship is so good. Can you give me one? Han Mingxi's eyes lit up as he looked at Yi Li eagerly. This thing might not be much to other people with strong martial arts. But to Han Mingxi, who had first-rate qinggong, second-rate internal energy and third-rate martial arts, it was simply a divine weapon. Yili glanced sideways at him and casually threw the gun in her hand over. Go back and find Qin Feng to teach you how to use it. Be careful. If this thing hits a vital point, it will be much more troublesome than arrows and concealed weapons. This was definitely not Yili trying to scare Han Mingxi. Don't talk about hitting a vital point. As long as it hit the body, it would be fine if the bullet directly went through it. It would just leave a hole. But if it stayed in the body, just how to take the bullet out would cause a lot of people to die. As for infection after injury, because the bullet contained a small amount of gunpowder and the wound was deep inside the body, the chances of infection were 10 times or even 100 times higher than normal swords. Han Mingxi had also seen the power of this thing, so he naturally held it carefully. Seeing Han Mingxi easily obtain the precious concealed weapon, Feng Xiao and Han Mingyue were also moved. Wang Fei, Yili only felt her scalp go numb as she helplessly said, "Don't ask me. There are only 3 of these things that have come out. It will take a few days to get more." Of course, there were many substandard products, but Yili did not dare give those things to Feng Xiao and the others. If it went off accidentally, it would be troublesome. Yili calculated that in at most 2 or 3 years, this standard pistol could be mass-produced. Maybe it could even be improved. Yili did not know if it was right to bring hot weapons into the era of cold weapons ahead of time. But since they had these things in their hands, and they had the foundation left behind by the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu, of course Yili couldn't just leave it alone. From cold weapons to bullets and so on, it was always the general trend of human development. It was not bad for them to be one step ahead. Not being able to get what they wanted, Feng Xiao and Han Mingyue were a little disappointed, but they also understood that there was nothing they could do about it. They could only make an agreement with Yili to give it to them first after it was made. Yili had no choice but to agree. Chapter 1006. Han Mingxi looked at his older brother and reluctantly handed the gun to Han Mingyue. "Big brother, you can play with it first." Han Mingyue reached out and took the gun. She twirled it in her hand and fired again. Young Master Mingyue had always been good at drawing inferences from one case. This time he had hit the nail on the head. Feng Xiao frowned and said, "This thing is a bit too loud. If it could be completely silent, then it would be a must-have for murder, arson and sneak attacks." From Feng Xiao's point of view, if several people suddenly fired at close range or at the same time, even an expert like Enchanting would find it difficult to escape unscathed. Yili raised her eyebrows. They would have silencers, but they couldn't make them for now. After hearing Feng Xiao's words, Han Mingyue looked down at the thing in her hand thoughtfully. "Speaking of which, we still don't know what this hidden weapon is called?" Han Mingxi asked. Such an amazing hidden weapon definitely deserved a gorgeous and amazing name. Unfortunately, Yili's answer disappointed him. "This is called a gun, a pistol." "Gun? How is this thing like a gun?" Feng Xiao was the first to object. The gun was the king of all weapons, and it was a powerful weapon on the battlefield. Just like Mo Xiuyao, who used a sword most of the time when he was young, he also used a silver coiling dragon spear to kill his enemies. Yili smiled and said, "In short, it's a gun." She waved her hand to indicate that there was no need to discuss it further. She didn't want to give her baby some weird name at all. Not giving Feng Xiao a chance to object, Yili waved her hand and left. They had just fired a few shots here, so they must have attracted a lot of attention. She didn't want to be surrounded by a large group of people. Han Mingyue was fiddling with the object in her hand with a curious look on her face. She looked as if she wanted to tear it apart and study it. Han Mingyue was different from Feng Xiao. He was not obsessed with the name of his weapon. Let alone Yili calling it a gun. Even if Yili called it a sword, he could totally treat it as a sword as long as it was useful. Ignoring Feng Xiao's protest, Han Mingyue held her new weapon and left without looking back. Only Han Mingxi and Feng Xiao were left looking at each other. After a long while, Feng Xiao asked, "Do you think this name is reliable?" Han Mingxi looked at him with a smile and said, "I have never used the gun you speak of, so I feel the name Wang Fei came up with must be very reliable." Feng Xiao faintly rolled his eyes. He should not have asked Han Mingxi. Other than his eldest brother, Han Mingxi was most obedient to Wang Fei. Seeing him deeply hurt, Han Mingxi patted his shoulder and comforted, "The name is not important. Wang Fei's hidden weapon is called a gun. Is your gun not a gun?" So from beginning to end, Yili forgot to tell them that it was not a hidden weapon. 20 miles away from Feihong Pass, the Xiling barracks had just suffered a strange attack from Prince Ding's mansion. Even Lei Jinting, who had unparalleled martial arts, was seriously injured. This made the Xiling army, which had been surging with vigor, feel like a goose that had suddenly been choked by someone's neck. Because they did not know if the Mahist army still had that kind of strange weapon, the Xiling army did not dare to camp too close to Feihong Pass. They could only retreat 10 miles. In the military camp in Lei Jinting's tent, the clothes on Lei Jinting's shoulders had been taken off. The doctors all frowned when they saw why Lei Jinting was injured. There was a medium-sized bloody hole below Lei Jinting's right shoulder. However, this made things difficult for the group of skilled doctors. If it was a bow or a hidden weapon, it would be fine. The arrow could be pulled out directly. Hidden weapons usually could not penetrate deeply. But Genom of Gojoseon's injury was deep in his body. Just a little bit more and his shoulder blade would have been shattered. Even though they could not see what kind of hidden weapon it was, they could feel that it was not big and its edges were not very clear. It was very difficult to take it out without hurting Genom of Gojoseon. Another way was to use internal energy to force the hidden weapon out. However, Lei Jinting was the only person in the military who had such a high level of internal energy. Lei Jinting's left hand was chopped off by Mo Lufeng more than 20 years ago. Even if Lei Jinting's right shoulder or left hand was injured, he would not be able to lift his hand to force the hidden weapon out of his back. If he wasn't careful, his originally uninjured bones would really be injured. Lei Jinting's expression was calm. He lowered his head and stared at the bloody hole below his shoulder. He frowned, but there was no pain on his face. "What do you all think?" One of the doctors thought for a while, then stepped forward and said, "We are incompetent. We have never seen such a hidden weapon before." "What will happen if it is forcefully taken out?" Lei Jinting asked. The doctor said cautiously, "The prince's martial arts are strong. If it is forcefully taken out, as long as it is properly treated, it should not be a big problem. However, I'm afraid that in the next few months the prince's right hand will." The doctor paused. He knew that Genom of Gojoseon understood what he meant. However, Genom of Gojoseon only had one arm. Now that he could not move his right hand, wouldn't that make him a cripple? Lei Jinting's eyes darkened. He thought for a long time before asking, "What if we don't take it out for now?" "Absolutely not." The doctor hurriedly said, "Prince, you absolutely cannot. Although we do not know what this hidden weapon is made of, it is definitely not appropriate to leave it in the body. Not to mention that this unknown object may cause harm to the body. If the wound is too deep, it may cause the wound to fester. In the end, the prince may not be able to move his entire shoulder. Or even die." Although telling Lei Jinting this put a lot of pressure on the doctor, if Genom of Gojoseon died due to improper treatment, they would only be more unlucky. Therefore, although the doctors stared at Lei Jinting's pressuring gaze, they still agreed with the doctor who spoke. Lei Jinting was silent for a long time. He was a decisive person. Even in the current situation, he could not shrink back or be nervous. He quickly calculated the situation in front of him before asking, "If we forcefully take it out now, we will do our best." The doctors said in unison. Lei Jinting sighed and said, "Then let's do it this way." It was not that Lei Jinting did not want to use other methods. However, there were not many people in the world who had the ability to force the hidden weapon out of his body without harming his foundation. Originally, he counted himself as one. It was Mo Xiuyao, Ling Taihan, and Mu Qingtsang. As for the others, perhaps Dongfang Yu, Ren Qining, and Han Mingyue could also give it a try. However, he could not find any of these people now. Or rather, he could not find any of them. Waving his hand to let the doctors go to prepare, Lei Jinting sighed alone in the tent. "You suffered such a heavy blow when you just set out. I still underestimated you." Faintly, for some reason, Lei Jinting suddenly had an ominous feeling in his heart. Chapter 1007. On the other side, Lei Jinting was surrounded by several doctors who were taking out the bullet. Although these doctors were highly skilled, it was the first time they had seen something like a bullet. Moreover, the bullet had penetrated deep into the flesh. If it had been a little bit more, it would have sunk into the bone. These doctors had no experience. Even though they were careful, they finally took out the bullet from Lei Jinting's shoulder. But it also made the injury on Lei Jinting's shoulder worse. If he didn't recuperate for 3 to 5 months, he probably wouldn't be able to recover. Even if he did recover in the future, there would probably be some sequelae that were neither light nor heavy. At least, Enchanting would be at the bottom of the 4 great masters of the world. The Shilling army was about to reach the city, but after a loud noise they suddenly retreated, leaving behind a ground full of blood and corpses. This made the soldiers of Feihong Pass curious. In the general's mansion, Yi Li was stopped by old General Yuan Pei. After hearing Yi Li's story, Yuan Pei could not help but laugh. Good stuff. God is helping our Mahist army. Feng Jiao rolled his eyes. Elder, what do you mean by God is helping us? These things were clearly made by Wang Fei. If the heavens were on Ding Wangfu's side, then Ding Wangfu would not have been so unlucky and had such hardships all these years. Yuan Pei stroked his white beard and laughed. Good, good. It is all thanks to Princess. Princess Consort, do you have any more bombs and gunpowder? Yi Li shook her head regretfully. Today I've used up all the stocks that I've had for the past 2 years. One must know that to blow up tens of thousands of people in one go, even in the modern era, the amount required was not a small amount. Not to mention the West Hill military camp. The terrain was flat and there was nothing there. It was just a direct explosion. With the current technology, if it was made into a grenade, it would be good enough to kill 2 people. Putting it together and directly igniting it would be more powerful. Feng Jiao said, Enchanting not being able to personally go to the battlefield is always beneficial to us. At the very least, because of what happened today, the morale of the Shilling army was definitely not going to improve in the short term. Yi Li smiled and nodded. That's right. Since that's the case, please prepare yourselves. I'll leave Feihong Pass to you. Everyone stood up and said, this subordinate obeys. On the other hand, Leng Huai and Lu Jingxian, who were originally stationed at the Chujing Chongqing city, had also met up with Mo Jingli's army outside of Liang City. With Mo Xiaoyao's death, the entire battlefield began to shift towards the northwest. The Cold Valley Pass, which was originally a strategic location, was now completely deserted. Mo Jingli blocked the path of the Mahist army in Liang City. However, Leng Huai and Lu Jingxian were in a hurry to rush back to Feihong Pass to reinforce the Prince Ding mansion. Neither side was willing to give in. In just a few days there were several battles, big and small, and both sides suffered casualties. In the end, Mo Jingli simply closed the city and did not come out. In any case, he did not ask to destroy Lu Jingxian and Leng Huai. As long as he defended Liang City and made Lu Jingxian and Leng Huai unable to pass, he would have already won. This way of avoiding battle made Lu Jingxian and Leng Huai even more angry than fighting face to face. Attacking a city was a very time-consuming thing. Back then, the northern region attacked Xijing Pass for half a year and did not break. After that, they attacked the capital of Dechu State for more than 3 months. However, what they lacked the most now was time. Even though Leng Huai and Lu Jingxian were calm and collected people, they could not help but secretly scold Mo Jingli for being despicable. In the Mahist army commander's tent, Lu Jingxian frowned and walked back and forth in the tent. Leng Huai, He Su and the others who were sitting on the side were also frowning. Leng Huai put down his teacup and sighed. General Lu, don't go. You're making me dizzy. LV Jingxian stared blankly for a moment before sitting down again. He said with a heavy expression, in just half a month, Enchanting has already led more than 10,000 troops to Feihong Pass. Moreover, there are still more troops coming to the north from the border of Shilling. I'm really worried. He was really worried that the princess could not hold on. In Feihong Pass, except for old General Yuan Pei, there were all young generals. Although General Yuan Pei was good at war, he was already over 70 years old. How could they not be worried? Leng Huai said, if Feihong Pass really cannot hold on, the princess will definitely call back Marquis Nan and General Murong. At that time they can hold on for a few days. What we need to do is to break into Liang City as soon as possible. Otherwise, even if Feihong Pass is broken now, we can only worry here. Mo Jingli has been like a coward these days. No matter how much we scold him, he won't come out. What can we do? Yun Ting said angrily. Of course, this anger was directed at Mo Jingli, who was hiding in the city and refused to come out to fight. Su Qingfeng frowned and said, why don't I bring people to sneak into the city and coordinate with them? Lu Jingxian shook his head and said, no, Liang City is easy to defend and hard to attack. Also, there are 800,000 soldiers in the city. Mo Jingli is not short of people now. Although Qi Lin is powerful, if he wants to sneak in too many people, I'm afraid he won't be able to do anything. If there were still loopholes for people to exploit with 800,000 soldiers guarding a city, Mo Jingli could bury himself now. Leng Huai suddenly smiled and said, "That's right, 800,000 people. How much food do you think Mo Jingli will have in Liang?" Liang was not a particularly big city. More importantly, Liang was not the main food production area of Dechu State. Therefore there would not be much food in the city. The amount of food needed for 800,000 people in a day was definitely not a small amount. Hearing this, Yun Ting raised his eyebrows and said with a smile, "We can still help him. We can't sneak in too many people, but it's always possible to find a few experts to set fire." Su Qingfeng stood up and nodded, "No problem, leave this to me." Naturally, this kind of thing could only be left to Qi Lin, who was the strongest individual soldier in the Mahist army and was proficient in all kinds of skills. Lu Jingxian nodded and said, "Thank you for your hard work, Commander Su. Mo Jingli will definitely not let his guard down. Commander Su, you must be careful." Su Qingfeng nodded, "Generals, just wait for the good news." Su Qingfeng did not beat around the bush. He said goodbye to everyone and left the tent. Leng Huai sighed and said, "I hope that Commander Su will succeed." Su thought for a while and asked, "Do we still need to arrange for people to intercept the troops behind Dechu State?" Lu Jingxian waved his hand and said, "There's no need for that. If Mo Jingli still has food behind him, let them come over." Although they did not know what Lu Jingxian was planning, seeing how calm he was, they guessed that he had an idea. Therefore they did not ask any more questions. Reporting to General Lu, "General Leng, there is a person called Yi outside the gate." A guard came in and reported. "Yi? Who is that?" Everyone was confused. Lu Jingxian thought for a while and said, "Let him in." Chapter 1008. The guards obeyed the order and went to invite the person. The people in the tent couldn't help but guess. Yun Ting rubbed his head and asked, "Could it be someone from Wang Fei's paternal family?" Of the people they knew, only Wang Fei had the surname Yi. Su raised an eyebrow and said, "In Wang Fei's paternal family, the only one who could be called young master's age is that boy from the Yi family called Yi Rong. Do you think it's possible for him to come all the way to the barracks?" Yun Ting came to a realization and immediately felt that his guess was ridiculous. He had seen that fatty Yi Rong before. He was clearly a scholar but was so fat that his eyes could not be seen. He did not have the noble air of a scholar who studied hard. Sometimes he looked even more vulgar than them who practiced martial arts. Speaking of which, Yi Shangshu had been a famous handsome man in the Chu capital. No matter what the characters of the Yi family's daughters were, at least they were all beauties. But they had given birth to a defective product like Yi Rong. However, the two old women of the Yi family were very protective of him, as if they were afraid he would be blown away by the wind when he went out. In reality, Yi Rong's appearance was definitely not ugly. When he was young, he could be considered a handsome child. It was a pity that Wang Shi did not know how to teach children. As the saying went, the appearance was born from the heart. Yi Rong did not even learn half of Yi Shangshu's talent. He was taught by Wang Shi all day long and his temperament became even more vulgar. In addition, he ate and drank so much these years that his body continued to expand. This gave Yun Ting, who had only seen him once, a very ugly impression. Leng Huai also shook his head. Even though he had lived in the Chu capital for decades, he did not remember anyone from the Yi family that could be brought out. He smiled and said, "Since he's here, we'll know who he is when we see him." A while later, an unfamiliar man in white walked in. He looked at everyone and said with a faint smile, "Hello everyone." Leng Huai and Lu Jingxian both frowned. The appearance of the man in front of them was average. He was the type that could not be remembered even if they saw him a few times. But due to his elegant white robes, the two were certain that they had never seen this man before. "This young master?" Leng Huai asked in a low voice. "Who are you?" Before Leng Huai could finish asking, Su, who was sitting on the side, had already stood up and stared coldly at the man in white. Everyone looked at him. And Su was calm. If there were no special circumstances, he would not speak to Leng Huai. Su narrowed his eyes and said, "He changed his appearance. But yes, after all, no matter how exquisite it was not a real face. There would always be some flaws. It was not plastic surgery." Since he couldn't hide it from Yi Li, he naturally couldn't hide it from Su, who was taught by Yi Li. Hearing Su's words, Everyone immediately became alert. The man in white smiled helplessly and sighed, "If I knew you were here, I wouldn't have done this." He raised his hand and wiped his face, revealing an extraordinarily handsome face. However, the crowd could not help but cry out in alarm, Your Highness." Ting was so shocked that the chair he was sitting on fell to the ground. He pointed at the man in front of him and said, What kind of demon are you? How dare you impersonate Prince?" It was no wonder that everyone was shocked. A few days ago, when the news of Mo Xiaoyao's death reached the army, Lu Jingxian and the others almost fainted from fright. Originally, they did not believe it until they heard that Wang Fei had already hidden Prince Ding in Feihong Pass. Even Lei Jinting and Mo Jingli had personally gone to pay their respects. Only then did everyone accept this grievous news. Now Mo Xiaoyao suddenly stood in front of everyone alive. How could they not be shocked? Mo Xiaoyao glanced indifferently at Ting and waved his hand. A gust of wind swept past, and an inkstone on Lu Jingxian's table instantly shattered. Everyone looked at each other and then looked at Mo Xiaoyao in front of them. There were not many people in the world who could have such exquisite and profound internal energy. Ting frowned and said, "Are you Ling Taihan or Mu Qingcong?" At least it was definitely not Lei Jinting. Lei Jinting only had one hand. It would be difficult for Mo Xiaoyao to become a two-handed Mo Xiaoyao. Su had already calmed down by now. After a long silence he said, "It really is Prince." Mo Xiaoyao sighed and took out an ink-colored jade pendant. He waved it and said, "Do you believe me now?" Seeing the ink-colored jade pendant in the Prince Ding mansion that represented Prince Ding's identity, everyone finally came back to their senses. Lu Jingxian and the others were even more excited. Prince, how did you?" For a moment, Lu Jingxian was also confused and could not express his meaning. They wanted to ask too many questions and for a moment they didn't know what to ask. It was Leng Huai who calmed down and asked, "Why is Prince here?" Mo Xiaoyao said, "I heard that you were blocked in Liang, so I came to take a look." "Your subordinates are useless, Prince, please punish us," Lu Jingxian and Leng Huai said in unison. Mo Xiaoyao waved his hand and said, "How can you be blamed for this? Originally it was I who suddenly had an accident that interrupted your deployment." Lu Jingxian asked worriedly, "Prince is really injured?" Mo Xiaoyao nodded and said, "He did receive some small injuries." The more Mo Xiaoyao downplayed it, the more worried Lu Jingxian and the others were. If he wasn't seriously injured, why would Prince Ding suddenly disappear? It should be known that the current situation did not benefit the Mahist army at all. Mo Xiaoyao shook his head and smiled, "I am really fine, but I just felt that this was an opportunity." He didn't want Li Li to think that he was seriously injured when he went back. Now that Mo Hua was by Li Li's side, Li Li would only think that he was deliberately killed in the explosion for the sake of plotting against her. Of course, he wasn't seriously injured in the first place. After sizing up Mo Xiaoyao and seeing that he was really fine, everyone let out a sigh of relief. Lu Jingxian asked, "What is Prince's plan?" Prince Ding suddenly came here. Naturally it couldn't be that he came to see them like he said. It must be because they were also a part of his plan. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and said, "There's no need to rush the plan. Let's get rid of Mo Jingli first." Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows slightly, not hiding the murderous intent that flashed through his eyes. "Prince is right," Lu Jingxian said. "Now that Lei Jinting's army is at Feihong Pass, we really need to get rid of Mo Jingli as soon as possible so that we can go back to the northwest and break the siege of Feihong Pass." Then he told them about the plan to let Su Qingfeng bring people into the city to burn Mo Jingli's provisions. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and smiled, "Very good, I will also go." Lu Jingxian frowned and said, "Although this is a serious matter, Prince doesn't need to personally take the risk. Prince, please reconsider." Mo Xiaoyao shook his head and said, "I have other things to do." Seeing that Mo Xiaoyao was determined to go, everyone stopped trying to persuade him. At the side, Su asked, "Prince, does the princess know the whereabouts of the prince? Should we send someone to inform the princess of the prince's whereabouts?" Mo Xiaoyao paused, then casually waved his hand and walked out. Chapter 1009. Ting and Su exchanged a look. Ting asked, "What does Prince mean by this? Is he not going to tell Wang Fei?" Su frowned and said, "I feel that it should be whatever." He did not say no, it was okay. Su felt that with Prince's personality, it was very likely that he did not tell Wang Fei his whereabouts this time. As he was wounded. Su, who was observant, naturally would not miss Mo Xiuyao's still slightly pale complexion and his slightly weakened appearance. Yunting thought and felt that Su was right. He nodded and said, "It doesn't matter. In any case, when they destroyed Mo Jingli, Wang Fei would know where Prince was." Yunting did not feel that there was a difference between 2 days earlier and 2 days later. Mo Xiuyao had just appeared in the army for a quarter of an hour before disappearing again. Before he left, he had strictly ordered that no one other than Yi Li was allowed to leak his information. But Mo Xiuyao's brief appearance had calmed the anxiety of Lu Jingxian and the others. With how much importance Prince placed on Wang Fei, if he was not worried about Fei Hong Pass, then it meant that Wang Fei and Fei Hong Pass were not in danger. Since that was the case, they naturally were not in a hurry. After Mo Xiuyao left the army camp, he did not find Su Qingfeng and the others to enter Liang with them. He waited until the sky darkened before he leisurely crossed the city walls and entered Liang City. As expected, the city was heavily guarded. Even though the sky had just darkened, there were no people walking on the streets. Every household had their doors closed as though they had gone to bed early. But even so, there were still many soldiers patrolling the streets. Could be said that there was a sentry every 5 steps and a guard every 10 steps. Clearly, Mo Jingli had suffered at the hands of Qi Lin and was on guard against them sneaking into the city. These heavily guarded sentries naturally didn't pose any obstacle to Mo Xiuyao. Mo Xiuyao leisurely shuttled through the streets and alleys of Liang City. According to the map of Liang City in his mind, he soon found his destination. It was originally the Liang governor's residence, which was also where Mo Jingli was temporarily staying. Mo Xiuyao's figure flashed and flew into the governor's office, heading towards the most lively place in the office. Tonight, the main hall of the governor's office was filled with singing and dancing. Mo Jingli was in a good mood as he sat on the chair, enjoying the wine and enjoying himself with this enchanting beauty. Although there were many things that made him feel very unhappy these days, overall it was still very good. Of course, to Mo Jingli, as long as Mo Xiuyao was dead, anything would make him happy. Therefore, even if the aristocratic families of Yunzhou did not care about his identity as the emperor and made him suffer a few soft rebuffs, Mo Jingli was still able to tolerate them. Glancing at the guests below, Mo Jingli smiled with satisfaction. So what if they were aristocratic families? They were nothing without power. Therefore he was the one at the top. Even if the people below were unwilling, they had no choice but to sit below and force a smile. "Mr. Chu, is it because I didn't serve you well? Why aren't you drinking?" Mo Jingli stared at a middle-aged man sitting on the first seat from the right and smiled faintly. His malicious eyes were filled with malice and complacency. This middle-aged man was the current head of the Chu family. He was also the cousin of the first madam of the Su family. The head of the Chu family said indifferently, "Thank you, Emperor Chu. I'm not feeling well and can't drink." A trace of viciousness flashed through Mo Jingli's eyes. He sneered, "Emperor Chu? So, Mr. Chu doesn't recognize himself as a citizen of the Chu state?" The head of the Chu family did not shrink back. He said calmly, "The Chu family is naturally a citizen of the Chu state. However, it depends on whether this Chu state is the Chu state. The Chu family only respects the orthodox bloodline of the imperial family." Presumptuous. Mo Jingli flew into a rage. Now that Mo Xiuyao had died, the biggest knot in Mo Jingli's heart was that he had not obtained the throne. Although he had used his power in Jiangnan to suppress all kinds of discussions in the court. However, Mo Siyun had died in the regent's residence. This was a fact that no one could avoid. Even if others did not say it on the surface, there were definitely many people who secretly cursed Mo Jingli for killing the emperor and seizing the throne. Previously, Mo Jingli had already made up his mind. When he returned, he would kill all of Mo Jingqi's sons and see who could say anything. At the same time, when the head of the Chu family mentioned the imperial bloodline, he also poked at another sore spot for Mo Jingli. Mo Jingli would never have a son that belonged to him in this life. As a result, not to mention the orthodox bloodline of the imperial family, the Chu state's imperial family would have no more descendants. In the future, he could only adopt a child from the imperial family to inherit the throne. When he thought of this, Mo Jingli could not help but feel a surge of anger in his heart. The head of the Chu family did not fear Emo Jingli's exposure at all. He calmly looked at the ruthless ruler in front of him. In reality, it was not that the Chu family was so daring that they had to oppose Emo Jingli. It was that the Chu family did not have high hopes for Emo Jingli as the emperor. For a large family that had lasted for many generations, the most important thing for them to be able to stand tall was to be able to hold their position. Even though Emo Jingli seemed to have the upper hand now, the Chu family did not think that Emo Jingli would have the last laugh. But Emo Jingli asked for all of the famous families in Yunzhou to be loyal to him. Yunzhou was a gathering place of people. Most of the famous families in Yunzhou were scholarly families. They had always had an extraordinary influence on the scholars of the world. Emo Jingli asked for all of these families to publicly swear loyalty to him and issue a statement against the Prince Ding mansion. This was something that no family head with foresight would be willing to do. Even now that Prince Ding had suddenly passed away, the Mahist army seemed to have fallen into a difficult situation. But do not forget that the Mahist army still controlled the Chu capital and the emperor of Shiling's city. Glass City was a quasi-capital. There were also places east of Cold Valley Pass, north of Spirit Vulture Mountain and west of Feihong Pass. The total area of these places was more than twice that of Jiangnan. In addition, the Prince Ding mansion was filled with famous generals. They also had the support of young Master Qin Qin and the Su family. The Chu family head really could not see where Emo Jingli's chances of winning lay. If they publicly went against the Prince Ding mansion now, when the Prince Ding mansion won in the future, the Chu family would be doomed. Even if they were lucky enough to escape this disaster, if the Chu family sided with the Prince Ding mansion again, they would be seen as fence-sitters and the Chu family's reputation would be ruined. Chu Shaoying, you are impudent. Do you think that I do not dare to kill you? Emo Jingli waved the wine cup in his hand. With a bang it fell to the ground and shattered into pieces. The Chu family head lowered his eyes. This one is speaking the truth. Even if Emperor Chu kills this one will still say the same thing. Emo Jingli suppressed the anger in his heart. He swept his gaze over the people below and asked, "What about you? Do you also have the same intentions as him?" After a while, someone finally couldn't withstand the pressure and stood up. He said in a trembling voice, "We are willing to pledge our loyalty to your majesty." Emo Jingli snorted lightly. He was not satisfied with this. These people were only from a few small and medium-sized families. Not a single one of the truly first-rate families stood up. Emo Jingli really wanted to drag these people out and kill them all. However, he had no choice but to endure at this time. "Mr. Chu, this one remembers that your Chu family has a young master called Chu Junwei?" Emo Jingli took a deep breath and suddenly asked. The Chu family head was stunned. He nodded with some surprise and said, "That's right. He is a nephew of the Chu family's branch family." Chapter 10:10. Oh. This young Master Chu can be considered an outstanding talent of his time. When I was in Jiangnan, I once had a good chat with him. Why didn't young Master Chu come today? Emo Jingli asked. A trace of confusion flashed through the Chu family head's eyes. He frowned and said, "When did Emperor Chu meet nephew Junwei?" "A few months ago." "That's impossible," the Chu family head said. Emo Jingli narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Chu, are you saying that I'm lying?" The Chu family head shook his head and said calmly, "No, it's just that. This nephew of mine is indeed outstanding. However, he already passed away several years ago. At the time he wasn't even 12 years old. He could be considered to have died young. How could he have a good chat with Emperor Chu?" Before the Chu family head finished speaking, Emo Jingli's face had already turned ashen. The various family heads who had been forced to attend the banquet looked at the man wearing the emperor's robes. His face was sometimes ashen, sometimes red and sometimes black. How could they not know what had happened? They were all born and raised in Liang. If the Chu family really had such an outstanding person, how could these local nobles not know? This clearly meant that Emo Jingli had been fooled by someone using the Chu family's name. Emo Jingli was instantly enraged by the humiliation of losing face in front of the masters of these prestigious families. He stared at the Chu family head and said, "Mr. Chu, what do you mean by this? Could it be that you think that I'm lying?" The truth had already reached this point. Emo Jingli had already guessed that he must have been fooled by that Chu Junwei back in Nanjing. After connecting the dots, Mo Jingli was almost certain that Chu Junwei had something to do with the Prince Ding mansion. However, in front of these people, how could he admit that he had been fooled by someone from the Prince Ding mansion? Moreover, the Chu family and the Su family were in-laws. It wouldn't be right for him to make an example out of the Chu family, right? The Chu family head said calmly, "This one doesn't dare." However, Junwei of the Chu clan has indeed passed away many years ago. If Emperor Chu doesn't have the surname, this one can take out the Chu clan's genealogy for Emperor Chu to look over. Mo Jingli naturally wouldn't do something like slapping himself in the face. He didn't care about the others' expressions and sneered and said, "The Chu clan secretly colluding with the Prince Ding mansion and attempted treason. Take him down for me, confiscate the entire Chu clan's property and detain him." Fortunately, Mo Jingli still retained some rationality. He only planned to imprison the Chu family and not directly execute them. Although he really wanted to do that. 2 guards quickly came forward, grabbed the Chu family head and dragged him out of the door. Everyone present couldn't help but be shocked when they saw this scene. Most of them were from prestigious families and many of them used to be families of government officials. No matter who was in charge, they had to give them some face. But who would have thought that in less than half a month after Mo Jingli arrived, the head of the Chu family, which was second only to the Su family in the entire Yunzhou and was now the #1 family in Yunzhou, would be dragged out so rudely. On the one hand, these family heads' impression of Mo Jingli was getting worse and worse. However, at the same time, they couldn't help but feel a chill in their hearts. It should be known that the status of these scholars was determined by the attitude of those in power. When those in power respected the scholars, their status was very high. However, in this chaotic world, when those in power viewed the scholars as ants, there was nothing they could do. Looking at these family heads whose expressions changed slightly, Mo Jingli sneered. He raised his cup and said, "Everyone, there's no need to spoil the mood for such a small matter. Come, let me propose a toast to everyone." Regardless of whether they were willing or not, at least this time, everyone raised their cups. Mo Jingli was pleased. With the Chu family's example, these people should know that if the ruler wants the subject to die, the subject has no choice but to die. Outside the hall, Mo Shuyao leisurely leaned against a tree outside the room. He closed his eyes and listened to everything that was happening inside. He didn't open his eyes until the Chu family head was dragged out. A smile flashed across his lips. The Chu family head was dragged by 2 guards to the governor's mansion's dungeon. Just as he was thinking about what to do next, a low voice suddenly entered his ears. "Don't worry, the Chu family won't be in danger." The Chu family head was stunned. However, the 2 guards beside him didn't react. It was as if what he heard was just a hallucination. However, he was very sure that he wasn't hallucinating. He really did hear a person's voice. It seemed to be very far away, but it also seemed to be in his mind. Who was it? As if understanding his doubts, the voice calmly said 3 words. "Mo Shuyao." The Chu family head lowered his head to hide the shock in his eyes. He finally remembered who this voice belonged to. That year, during Master Qingyun's birthday, he also went to Glass City. Originally, according to the relationship between the Chu family and the Su family, it was natural for the Chu family to submit to the Prince Ding mansion. However, the Chu family and the Su family were different. Although the Su family was also a large family, they didn't have many descendants. As for the Chu family, not to mention the various branches, just the recent generations of the main family were enough to shock people. They were also spread all over the country. Once the main family of the Chu family moved to Glass City, these branch family members would be in big trouble. Moreover, the situation at the Prince Ding mansion wasn't as clear as it was later. Therefore, the Chu family only went to express their goodwill to the Chu family and the Su family. They didn't pledge their loyalty to the Prince Ding mansion. Although 1 or 2 years had passed, the Chu family's patriarch still remembered Prince Ding's deep and unique voice that could easily make people submit to him. The Chu family head didn't have the time to be shocked that Prince Ding didn't die. Instead, he appeared at Mo Jingli's camp in Liang. As the head of a large family, he could quickly calm down and realize that this was a great opportunity for the Chu family. When he thought up to here, a trace of a resolute expression flashed in the eyes of the Chu clan's patriarch, and he suddenly said, "Go report to His Majesty Emperor Chu. The Chu clan is willing to swear loyalty to Emperor Chu." Chapter 10-11. Although they were surprised by the Chu family's master's sudden change of heart, the two guards still dutifully brought him back to the main hall. After all, the emperor didn't plan on killing the Chu family's master. It wouldn't be easy for someone like him to die. If he was allowed to make a comeback, he could easily kill these worthless guards with a single slap. As expected, Mo Jingli immediately ordered for the Chu family's master to be brought back to the main hall. This time the Chu family's master didn't hesitate at all and knelt on the ground. He lowered his head and said, "This commoner Chu Shaoying kowtows in salute to the emperor." Everyone present was in an uproar. It had to be known that the Chu family was the most indifferent to Mo Jingli. Furthermore, due to the relationship between the Chu family and the Su family, everyone knew that even if the Chu family pledged their loyalty to Mo Jingli, they still wouldn't be able to obtain anything important. Mo Jingli raised his eyebrows in satisfaction. When he saw the Chu family's master kneel in front of him, Mo Jingli felt an indescribable joy in his heart. It was as if he was looking at the Su family kneeling in front of him. Mo Jingli raised his eyebrows and asked, "Mr. Chu, why did you change your mind so quickly?" The Chu family's master lowered his head and said, "This commoner was confused for a moment. Please forgive me, Your Majesty. The Chu family is destroyed by this commoner's hands. This commoner will not be able to absolve himself from the blame even if he dies 10,000 times." Mo Jingli looked pensive. If Chu Shaoying had given him some other reason, he might not have believed him. However, Mo Jingli knew that these so-called aristocratic families viewed their own families as more important than anything else. They were willing to sacrifice anything for the continuation of their families. If it was for the sake of the Chu family, then it was reasonable. The Chu family is willing to pledge their loyalty to us? Then what about our previous suggestion? Mo Jingli asked. Chu Shaoying nodded and said, "Yes, the Chu family is willing to pledge loyalty to Your Majesty. We hope that Your Majesty can unite the mountains and rivers as soon as possible. The Chu family will do everything in our power to satisfy Your Majesty's orders." Mo Jingli was finally satisfied when he saw his reaction. He laughed heartily and personally got up to serve Chu Shaoying. She smiled and said, "I was just joking with you, Mr. Chu. Please don't take offense." Chu Shaoying's face was pale. He nodded respectfully and said, I wouldn't dare." It was as if he was really frightened. Mo Jingli glanced at everyone present and said with a smile, "Mr. Chu's righteousness comforts us. What do you think of the other matters?" The family heads who were closest to the Chu family were also people who didn't think highly of Mo Jingli. They all looked at Chu Shaoying in confusion. Chu Shaoying looked down indifferently and nodded slightly. Even though they didn't know why he suddenly changed, these people still had some confidence in Chu Shaoying. The Chu family couldn't possibly give up on the Prince Ding mansion and the Su family. Instead, they would pledge their allegiance to Mo Jingli. Even if the Prince Ding mansion was going to fall, it would be better for them to live in seclusion rather than pledge their allegiance to Mo Jingli. At least they wouldn't have to worry about their family being exterminated or being played to death by Enchanting. After thinking for a while, the people all stood up and said, "We are willing to pledge our loyalty to Your Majesty." "Good. That's great. Come, let us toast to Mr. Chu and everyone else." Mo Jingli laughed in satisfaction. His anger from before had been completely swept away. Peace had just returned to the hall, but it seemed like the heavens had decided that tonight's banquet wouldn't go smoothly. Someone hurriedly came in from outside to report. "Reporting to Your Majesty, the Mahist army has moved into the city and just set fire to the granary in the west of the city." "What?" Mo Jingli slammed the table and walked out. He sternly asked, "Where are they?" "Voting. Your Majesty generally is leading people to arrest them." The person who came to report quickly said, "Arrest them? Arrest my ass. They only found out after they had people sneak into the city and set fire to the granary. What are they doing?" Mo Jingli angrily kicked away a wooden table in front of him and roared angrily, This subordinate knows his mistake. Enough." Mo Jingli cut off his meaningless apology. He swept his eyes over everyone present and coldly said, "You can all go back first. That's all for tonight." Chu Shaoying and the others stood up and bid farewell. Chu Shaoying thought for a bit before walking forward and saying, "Your Majesty, the Chu family still has some food stored up. We are willing to offer it to Your Majesty to solve this urgent problem." Hearing Chu Shaoying's words, Mo Jingli's expression relaxed a bit. He nodded and said, "Then I thank Mr. Chu." After everyone left, Jingli coldly asked, "How much was burned?" The person below couldn't help but gulp and say in a trembling voice, "The 3 granaries in the west of the city were all burned at the same time. The granary in the north of the city was also mostly burned. Our army's food. I'm afraid it won't last for more than 2 days." Jingli's brows slightly furrowed. He wasn't too worried about the food. The march this time was in a hurry, so not all of the food had arrived. At most, the food would arrive in a few days. Not to mention, there were many rich families in Liang City. Even if these people didn't look as rich as the so-called rich merchants, they had more resources than the rich merchants. Now that the world was in chaos, he would never believe that these people didn't secretly store food. What really made Jingli uneasy was the Mahist army that sneaked into the city. Liang City was heavily guarded, but the Mahist army was still able to sneak into the city and set fire to the food. This made Jingli feel very shocked and uneasy. "Tell General Li to capture all of the Mahist army that entered the city," Jingli said in a deep voice. "This subordinate obeys. Get out." Seeing the people below scramble out, Jingli looked at the empty hall in front of him with annoyance. He raised his hand and fiercely smashed the wine cup in front of him on the ground. "Moshia, you're already dead. I don't believe I can't beat you." In the middle of the night, Jingli was drunk as he was helped back to his room by a servant. The enchanting woman who had been waiting there quickly came up and helped him to the bed. She softly said, Emperor, are you drunk?" Jingli looked at the woman in front of him with drunken eyes and said, "Impudent. Who are you?" The woman said in a wrong tone, "Emperor, what's wrong?" "I'm Consort Li." "Consort Li?" Jingli was in a bad mood because he had drunk too much. He was a bit confused for a moment. "Who is Consort Li?" You are." Consort Li said with a happy smile, "It's me. Although she was only a dancer, she was Jingli's most beloved concubine. Otherwise, Jingli wouldn't have brought her with him even when he was on the battlefield." Jingli nodded and said, "It's you. Yi Li." Consort Li felt the top of her head go cold and couldn't react for a moment. She had naturally heard of Yi Li's name before, but she didn't think that the emperor would call out Princess Ding's name in this kind of place. In regards to this, imperial concubine Li did not feel any jealousy. When the difference between a person and another person was too great, she couldn't even feel jealousy. She only felt shock and faintly felt that hearing this wasn't a good thing for her. Chapter 10-12. The completely drunk Jingli did not have the mind to care about Consort Li's shock. He grabbed the woman in front of the OP and kissed her. As he kissed her, he muttered, "Yi Li. Yi Li, you actually dare to reject this one." Over and over again. "Huh. Now that Xiuyao is dead, you'll be this one sooner or later. Since you don't know how to appreciate kindness, this one will take back the promise from before. This one will demote you to the lowest level of concubine. Yi Li." Consort Li was so scared by Jingli's words that she did not dare to move. She wanted to leave and faint as if she didn't hear anything. Just as she was about to cry, she felt a pain in her back and she immediately lost consciousness. Beside the large and luxurious bed, there was a white-clothed man standing there. Just the killing intent in his eyes was enough to make anyone retreat. Even Jingli, who was lying on the bed with the beauty in his arms and was so drunk that he couldn't tell the difference between north and south, instinctively felt a chill. He couldn't help trembling as he hugged the woman in his arms even tighter. "Yi Li. This one will definitely have you. This one will definitely let you know that this one is stronger than Xiuyao." Xiuyao looked down at the man and woman on the bed. His originally handsome eyes were now filled with a sinister scarlet color, as if he was a ghost from the underworld. Xiuyao leaned over and raised his hand to slowly stroke Jingli's neck. Jingli, who was still sleeping, did not know that if the person in front of him used a bit more strength, he would never wake up again. After a while, the hand that was holding his neck slowly let go. He turned his hand towards the woman in Jingli's arms. The unconscious woman's body trembled and a trace of blood leaked out from the corner of her lips. She quickly stopped breathing. Xiuyao didn't have the slightest bit of pity in his eyes. This woman might be innocent, but she definitely couldn't live after hearing such words. Xiuyao stood by the bed for a while. then his lips suddenly curved into a bloodthirsty smile. Half an hour later, a white figure flashed out of the governor's office and disappeared into the dark night. In the west of Liang City, the head of the Chu family, Chu Xiaoying, had just sent off a wave of De Chu state soldiers who had come to search for him and return to his study. There were already several people sitting in the study. When they saw Chu Xiaoying walk in, one of them immediately stood up and grabbed Chu Xiaoying and asked anxiously, "Brother Chu, what are you thinking? Today's matter, that Mo Jingli seems to be. Which of these people who could control such a large family head wasn't a shrewd person? In their opinion, even if Prince Ding died and the Mahist army was defeated, Mo Jingli would probably be swallowed up by Genom of Gojoseon. Even if they took 10,000 steps back, Mo Jingli had stabilized the situation. With Mo Jingli's personality, they definitely wouldn't have a good time in the future. At that time they would probably have to give up the bow after the birds are killed." Chu Xiaoying looked at everyone and said with a smile, "Everyone here is my close friend and I know everyone's surname. I won't lie to everyone. To be honest, I also don't think Mo Jingli will succeed." "Then, Brother Chu, what are you doing?" Everyone didn't understand. After publicly pledging loyalty to Mo Jingli, if they betrayed him, then the reputation of the Chu family would be gone. Moreover, even if they pledged allegiance to someone else in the future, they probably wouldn't be put in an important position. After all, if the Chu family could rebel against Mo Jingli, then they could rebel against someone else in the future. Chu Xiaoying smiled and didn't say anything. One of the people saw the smile on Chu Xiaoying's face and said, "Could it be that Brother Chu has already made his decision?" Chu Xiaoying nodded and said, "That's right." Everyone looked at each other. One of them dipped his hand in water and wrote the word "set" on the table. Everyone present had an expression of "as expected." Chu Xiaoying said seriously, "I've put my life and the Chu family in everyone's hands. Everyone please." "Brother Chu, what are you saying? You and I have known each other for decades. Don't you trust each other?" "To be honest, Brother Chu and I have the same idea. It's just that we haven't had any connections. With the relationship between the Chu family and the Su family, it should be much more convenient." Although Prince Ding wasn't around now, young Master Qingchen was. The Prince Ding mansion's little heir was already 8 or 9 years old. With the help of young Master Qingchen and the 2 masters of the Su family, he would definitely be able to hold his own in less than 10 years. At that time, it was hard to say who would have the final say in this world. At least, the Prince Ding mansion seemed far more reliable than Mo Jingli. Chu Xiaoying smiled and said, "Many thanks, everyone. As long as the Chu family is still around, you won't lose out." Hearing Chu Xiaoying's promise, everyone couldn't help but smile. Originally, Chu Xiaoying was still stubbornly refusing to pledge allegiance to Mo Jingli. However, after going out for a trip, he suddenly changed his mind. Mo Jingli might think that Chu Xiaoying was afraid, but how could they, who had known each other for decades, not know what kind of person Chu Xiaoying was? Without full confidence, Chu Xiaoying definitely wouldn't risk the Chu family. "Since that's the case, we'll leave everything to Brother Chu. We'll listen to all of Brother Chu's orders." Everyone cupped their hands and smiled. Chu Xiaoying nodded and replied solemnly, "Everyone please don't worry. Chu Xiaoying definitely won't betray everyone's trust. In that case, we'll have to trouble Brother Chu. We'll take our leave. We won't see you out." After sending everyone out of the study, Chu Xiaoying closed the door. Just as he turned around, he almost jumped in fright. A white-clothed man was sitting in the originally empty study, looking at him leisurely. He was even holding a cup of hot tea in his hand. Just as he was sending this person out, this person not only entered the study, but even had the time to make a cup of tea for him. After being stunned for a moment, Chu Xiaoying came back to his senses and bowed respectfully to the white-clothed man. Chu Xiaoying greets His Highness Prince Ding. Mo Shuyao nodded with a smile and said, "Mr. Chu, there's no need to be so courteous. I've let Mr. Chu suffer tonight." Mo Shuyao inwardly praised Chu Xiaoying's extraordinary composure. Even though the Su family was full of heroes, the Chu family's reputation was only average. However, to be able to control the second most powerful family in Yunzhou, which was also one of the top 5 families in the entire Dechu state, Chu Xiaoying's abilities were definitely not ordinary. After meeting him tonight, he realized that this family head was indeed a truly intelligent person. However, compared to the innate intelligence of the Su family, this person was more like a great intellectual who appeared to be stupid. Chu Shaoying smiled bitterly and said frankly, Prince Ding, you're exaggerating. If it wasn't for Prince Ding's reminder tonight, I'm afraid. Mo Xiuyao understood Chu Shaoying's meaning. No matter what, in Chu Shaoying's eyes, the Chu family was still the most important. If Mo Xiuyao hadn't appeared, Chu Shaoying would have very likely compromised with Mo Jingli when he had no other choice. Mo Xiuyao waved his hand, indicating that there was no need to worry about this matter. Chu Shaoying hurriedly thanked him, then cautiously sat down and asked, Prince Ding, do you have any orders for entering the city in the middle of the night? Mo Xiuyao smiled faintly and said, I can't say that I have any orders. In 3 days the Mahist army will definitely break into Liang City. Before that, I hope that in the name of the Chu family and the great families of Yunzhou I will announce this to the world. Mo Xiuyao took out a letter filled with his own words and handed it to Chu Shaoying. Chu Shaoying received it and glanced at it. He couldn't help but twitch the corner of his mouth. As he read further, his expression changed. In it, Mo Xiuyao had used the secret medicine in the southern border to murder the late Emperor Mo Jingqi, hounding Mo Xiyun to death, putting the Empress Dowager under house arrest, detaining the soldiers' pay and provisions in Zijing Pass, causing Zijing Pass to be breached by the northern tribes, and finally sending troops to the Chu capital. If these were really released, Mo Jingli's reputation would be ruined, and everyone would want to beat him up. You're tuning in to the Biao's Wuxiao Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.